The next day I scraped together 500 marks and brought them to the Narconon offices. Then I took out a loan for 1,000 marks and made the payment at the next parents' evening. A group of reformed addicts ran these evenings. You couldn't tell that the one I saw used to be a junkie, at least I couldn't. He looked pretty normal. That was thanks to Narconon, he said. After getting clean, he'd become a new person. That certainly impressed all the parents. And he assured me, in particular, that Christiane was making good progress. It turned out that they were just putting on an act. Like everyone else, they just wanted our money. Later I found out, in a newspaper article, that Narconon belonged to a dubious American religious organization, and that it was profiting from parents' fears about their children. But as usual, I didn't realize what was going on before much too late. Initially, I thought that Christiane was in the best of hands. I wanted to leave her there for as long as possible. But in order to do that, I needed money. I ran from one government office to the next, from one department to the next. But nobody wanted to take any responsibility for Christiane. And at the same time, nobody told me what was really going on at Narconon. I felt discouraged. I felt conned. Everyone acted like I was just wasting their time. Then finally, somebody told me that I first needed to get a statement from a government-approved doctor certifying that Christiane was indeed a drug addict before I could even begin to apply for reimbursement of her therapy fees. I thought that was a joke. Anyone who knew even a little bit about this topic could plainly recognize the misery in Christiane's face. But those were the rules. The thing was, when I finally managed to get an appointment with the officially approved doctor, an appointment that took 2 weeks for me to get, Christiane had run away from Narconon again. It was already the 3rd time. I broke down and cried. I thought, now it'll start all over again. We're back at square one. Every time that she returned, I was convinced that this was the time that she would finally make it, and every time, I was disappointed. My boyfriend and I went out to look for her. In the afternoons we'd check out the park that young people often hung out at called Hasten Hyde 36, at night we'd go downtown and to the clubs, and in between we'd go scouring the subway stations. We went wherever the drugs were. With each new day, we'd renew the hunt. We even checked the public bathrooms all over the city, just in case. We'd reported her as missing, but they only said that they'd add Christiane to their missing persons list. She'd show up again, they said. All I wanted to do was crawl into a hole and disappear. I was consumed by fear. Fear of that phone call, "Your daughter is dead." I was just a bundle of nerves. I wasn't interested in anything anymore, and I didn't want to do anything. I had to force myself to go to work. I started getting heart palpitations, and I could hardly move my left arm. At night it would tingle and go numb. My stomach was constantly upset. My kidneys hurt and my head felt like it was going to explode. I was physically and mentally spent. I went to my doctor, who told me it was all nerves and prescribed me some Valium. When I told him why I was such a mess, he said that a couple of days ago another such young girl had come to him, confessed her drug addiction, and asked him for advice on what she should do. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her to go and hang herself." That was his answer. Just like that. It was hopeless. When Christiane showed up again at Narconon a week later, I couldn't even bring myself to feel relief. It was like a part of me had died. I was of the opinion that I had done everything humanly possible, but nothing had helped. Whatever I did, things always got worse. It was like a snowball tumbling downhill. Narconon had done more harm than good. Christiane had changed during her time there. She made a bad impression now. She was vulgar, almost to the point of repulsiveness, and had lost whatever girlish innocence she still had left. I was suspicious even during my first visit to Narconon. Christiane had become a stranger to me already. Something had been destroyed. Up until then, despite everything, she'd still had a connection to me, but now that was gone. It was like she'd been brainwashed. It was at this point that I asked my ex-husband to take Christiane out of Berlin, to Western Germany. But he preferred to take her in himself. He'd be able to deal with her, he said. And if she didn't cooperate, then maybe a little corporal punishment would help. I didn't object. I'd reached the end of my rope. I'd already made so many mistakes and miscalculations that suddenly I was afraid to take any further actions of my own. Before we went home to my dad's, he dragged me with him to his favorite bar, the Hungry Woodpecker, at the Vitskyly subway station. He wanted to order me a drink 37, but I just wanted some juice. He said I had to put a stop to taking drugs if I didn't want to die, and I said, well, yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to stay at Narconon. The jukebox kept playing the same song over and over again. A few teens were playing pinball and pool. My dad said that they were all just good, normal teens. If I hung out here more often, I'd make some new friends and realize how crazy and stupid it was to mess around with junkies and other dope fiends all the time. I was barely listening. I was angry and exhausted and just wanted to be left alone. I hated everyone, and just when I felt like I might have found a kind of escape, a route to a better life, my dad had slammed the door right in my face. I took Janie into bed with me that night and asked her, Janie, do you understand us humans? I answered for her, no, of course you don't. You run up to everyone, wagging your tail. You think people are good. I didn't like that about her. I would have preferred it if she would have growled at people first. She shouldn't be so trusting. When I woke up, I saw that Janie hadn't yet peed on the floor, so I was eager to take her out right away. My dad had already left for work. Viv and I went to open the front door, it was locked. I yanked at the door handle, I threw myself against the door. It stayed shut. I forced myself to stay calm and not to freak out. How could my own dad lock me up like a wild animal? Especially when he knew I had a dog. I tore through the apartment, looking for a key. I thought he must have put a key somewhere. What if there was a fire? I looked under the bed, on the windowsills, even in the fridge. No key. I didn't have time to really freak out because I had to do something with Janie before she ruined the carpet. I took her out on the balcony, and she understood not what to do. Then I went to take a tour of my little prison. A lot had changed since I'd last been here. The bedroom was empty since my mom had taken the beds with her. There was a new couch in the living room, where my dad now slept, and a brand new color TV. The rubber plant was gone, and so was the bamboo rod that my dad used to beat me with and store in that pot. Now there was a jade tree plant instead. The old wardrobe was still in the kids' room, and you could still only open one of its doors, otherwise the whole thing would collapse. The bed made creaking and cracking noises whenever you moved. It's pretty sad when your own dad can't even provide you with a decently furnished holding cell. I went back out to the balcony with Janie. She put her front paws on the railing and looked down from our 11th floor apartment. All we could see were the desolate high-rises and barren landscapes of Gropiusstadt. I had to talk to someone, so I called up Narconon. They had a surprise for me. Babsy had shown up. So I guess she'd actually been serious about quitting. She told me that they'd given her my bed. I was so sad that I wasn't there with her. We talked for a long time. When my dad came back, I gave him the silent treatment, but that just had the effect of making him talk even more. He'd planned my whole future out for me. Gave me an actual schedule for every day, including housework, grocery shopping, and feeding his homing pigeons and cleaning up their roost. He had a shelter for his pigeons out in Rudau, too. Every time he went out, he wanted to be able to check up on me by phone. To fill up all my free time, he'd found an old friend of mine, Katharina, who was willing to come and hang out with me. She was a real teen bopper, still in love with top 40 radio and other crap like that. A reward was in it for me, too. He wanted to take me to Thailand with him sometime. He flew to Thailand at least once a year now. He loved it there because of the girls, but also because he was able to get some really cheap clothes. He saved up all of his money for these trips of his. In a way, that was his drug of choice. So I listened to my dad's plans and thought I'd just play along for a while. I didn't really have a choice, anyway. At least that way I wouldn't be locked up. The next day I had a packed schedule. First I had to clean the apartment and then go shopping. Then Katharina came over to take me for a walk. We went all over the place, and then when I told her that I still had to go to Rudao to feed the pigeons, she lost interest and gave up. So I had the rest of the afternoon to myself. I was miserable, and one way or another I just wanted to get high. I didn't really know what to do though. I thought that maybe I could go to the Hazen Hyde for an hour. That's a public park in Newcombe and a good place to go if you want to smoke some weed. A joint sounded pretty good right then. I didn't have any cash, but I knew where I could find some. My dad collected silver coins in an oversized brandy bottle. There were more than 100 marks in that bottle, stored up for his next trip to Thailand. I shook 50 marks out of the bottle. I wanted to have a little extra with me, just in case. Whatever was left over I could put back, and then I thought I could probably replace what I'd spent with money I saved while shopping. That was my plan anyway. In Hazen Hyde Park, I ran into Pyatt. He was the kid from Center House who was with me when I'd smoked pot for the first time in my life. He'd become a heroin addict, so I asked him if they had anything besides weed at this park of his. He asked, "Do you have cash?" I told him I did. "Come with me then." He took me to a couple of dealers, and I bought a quarter. I had 10 marks left now. We went to the public bathrooms at the entrance to the park, and Pyatt let me borrow his syringe. He'd become a really slick old junkie in the time since I'd last seen him, and I had to give him half of my dope to use his syringe. We both gave ourselves a little fix. I felt amazing. The atmosphere at Hazen Hyde Park was way better, way less fucked up than at places like Kurfürstendamm or Zoo Station. The fact that it was mainly just a place to smoke some weed made all the difference in the world. But there were still some junkies, if you poked around a little bit. It didn't cause problems, though, as the junkies and the potheads were generally able to chill out together, side by side. At the Kudam, pot was disdained, it was for lightweights and potheads were generally snubbed. The two groups never mixed at Kurfürstendamm. At Hazen Hyde, it didn't matter what drug you were on. You could even be sober. It wasn't an issue. You just needed to be cool. That was it. Whether you were high or not, if you were cool, then everyone else was cool with you. It was like everyone was part of a big, peaceful community, making music, banging on drums, and just hanging out. The whole atmosphere reminded me of Woodstock. I was home again before my dad got back from work around 6. He didn't notice that I was high. I was feeling a little guilty because I hadn't been able to feed the pigeons. I decided to give them a double portion the next day. I thought that the next time I went to the park I wouldn't shoot up because even if I just smoked a little pot I would feel alright, and I would still be accepted, too. I never wanted to return to the nasty heroin scene at Kurfürstendamm. I truly believed I could manage to get off of H at Hazen Hyde. I started going to the park with Janie every afternoon, even if it was just for a minute. The dog loved it there because there were lots of other dogs running around. And even the dogs were totally friendly. Everyone liked Janie, and she got a lot of attention. I only fed the pigeons every second or third day. That was more than enough as long as I stuffed them and left some extra on the floor for them. I would smoke weed whenever someone asked me, and someone always did. That's also one of the major differences between the people who smoke pot and the people who shoot heroin. Potheads are always willing to share. I also got to know the foreign guy who had dealt to Pyatt and me on that first day. When I saw him again, he was lying down on a blanket with a couple of other friends of his, also foreigners. He invited me over, and I lay down in the grass next to their blanket. The dealer's name was Mustafa and he was Turkish. The others were Arabs, and they were all under 20 years old. They were just having a picnic of flatbread with cheese and melon, and they shared some of their lunch with me and Janie. Mustafa was kind of cool, I thought. He was a dealer, but he was cool about it. He wasn't crazy or cocky or unpredictable like all the big shot dealers were. While we talked, Mustafa pulled up clumps of grass and buried his bags of dope inside the cavities. So even if the cops raided the whole area, they'd never find his dope. If someone wanted to buy from him, Mustafa would then calmly poke around in the grass with his pocket knife until he found the supply. He didn't weigh out his baggies like all the other dealers did. He just gave you what he took out with his knife. The portions were good though. Whatever stuck to the knife, he'd wipe off with 2 fingers and let you snort. Mustafa said right off the bat that shooting up was fucked up. The only way to keep from getting addicted was to snort it. So that's what he and all his friends were doing. They only snorted once in a while, if they felt like it. None of them appeared to be addicted. Mustafa didn't want me to become addicted again, so he was careful about how much he gave to me. These guys really knew how to handle heroin. I started seeing Mustafa and the other foreigners in a different light. They weren't like the predatory customers that had always offended Stella, Babsy, and me. They were very proud and easy to offend. They accepted me because I seemed very self-confident and maybe because I was a pretty quick study and realized quickly how things worked with them. To give just one example, you weren't ever allowed to ask for anything. Hospitality was extremely important to them. If you wanted something, you just helped yourself, whether it was sunflower seeds or heroin that you wanted. But you had to be careful not to give them the impression that you were taking advantage of their hospitality, so it would have never crossed my mind to ask Seem if I could take some H with me when I left. Whatever I took from them, I snorted immediately. Because I was able to assimilate so quickly, they kind of took me in, despite the fact that they didn't generally think very highly of German girls. And they had a point, in a lot of ways, they really were better than us. I loved everything about this world and even started to think that I'd kicked the habit for good, until, that is, I took a look in the mirror and saw that, once more, I was physically dependent on the drug. In the evenings, I played the role of the rehabilitated daughter for my dad. I'd go to the Hungry Woodpecker with him and would sometimes drink a small glass of beer, just to please him. To some extent I hated this bar, but at the same time I couldn't help wanting to be accepted here as well. I wanted to have a place here and be able to assert myself in this world where drugs didn't really have a role. I practiced on the pinball machines and practiced intensely at the pool table. I also wanted to eventually learn how to play Scat. 38-1 wanted to master all the masculine games. I wanted to be better than the men. If I had to spend time in this sorry environment, then at least I wanted to be able to make a reputation for myself. I didn't want to feel like people were looking down on me. I wanted to be treated like a star. I wanted to be strong and independent. Like Mustafa and his friends. I didn't want to have to ask for anything. However, my first goal, to learn to play Scat, was already falling apart. I now had other things to worry about. I was going into withdrawal again. I absolutely had to get over to the park every afternoon, and I needed to be able to spend some time there, as I couldn't just snort some of Mustafa's dope and go. I had to sit there and, in an unspoken way, negotiate with him, calmly chewing on sunflower seeds. Meanwhile, my dad's pigeons were now on their third day of going without. Every afternoon I had to lose Katharina, my chaperone, all over again, and then there was all the housework and grocery shopping to be done, and I had to always be careful to stay near the phone, in case my dad started calling. I was already running out of explanations for why I hadn't answered earlier. I wasn't feeling very good about things anymore. Then, one day, someone came up behind me and clasped his hands over my eyes. I turned around, and there was Ditlev. We hugged and kissed each other like our lives depended on it, and Janie jumped excitedly beside us. Ditlev looked good. He said he was clean. I looked him in the eyes and said, "Yeah right, clean as a hog in mud. Your pupils are almost invisible already." Ditlev had quit while he was in Paris, but back at Zoo Station he'd had a shot. We went home to my dad's. We still had some time before he got back from work. My bed was too rickety, so I laid the comforter on the floor and we had sex. It was great. When it was over, we talked about getting clean again. Not right away, of course, but we planned to start the following week. Ditlev told the story of how he and his friend had ripped off a customer to get the cash they needed for the trip to Paris. They'd simply locked the guy into his kitchen, calmly swiped his packet half-euro checks 3s and sold the checks for 1,000 marks to someone at Zoo Station. Bernd was already in jail for it, but Ditlev didn't think that the cops would be able to find him since the customer didn't know his name. We started meeting at the park every day, and most of the time we also managed to spend some time at my dad's as well, after we'd shot up. We didn't talk much about our plans for getting clean because we were just so happy to be together again. But it was getting more and more difficult for me to keep all the balls up in the air. My dad was checking up on me more often now and kept finding new chores for me to do. I needed even more time with Mustafa to get enough dope for Ditlev, too. And I wanted to be able to spend some time alone with Ditlev as well. All the old stresses had returned. Also, at around this time I realized that in order to get all the money we needed, I would have to start working at Zoo Station again. I kept that fact secret from Ditlev. But my feelings of optimism and hope were being gradually eroded as I was drawn into the junkie's routine all over again. The honeymoon period after withdrawal, the time when you can just relax and not worry about the pressure of scoring, was decreasing with every successive withdrawal. About a week after Ditlev came back, Rolf turned up at Hazen Hyde Park. He was distraught and told me that the police had caught Ditlev. They'd picked him up during a drug raid, and while they were at it, they also slapped him with the burglary charge. The guy who bought the checks from them had ratted him out. I went to the bathrooms at the Hermannplatz, locked myself in, and cried until I felt totally drained. We'd flushed everything down the drain again. I was back in the real world, where I felt more hopeless than ever. I was scared about how much I was craving my next fix already. I just couldn't bear the thought of having to sit next to the Arab guys, calmly spitting out sunflower seeds and just waiting for them to offer me a snort. So instead, I took the subway to Zoo Station, sat on a ledge, and waited for customers. It was dead at the station, however, because apparently there was some big soccer game on TV. But eventually someone showed up, and it turned out to be someone I knew. It was Heinz, who'd been Stella's and Babs's regular. He was the guy who always paid in heroin and would add syringes as a bonus, but the thing was, he wanted to have sex. I didn't care anymore though. I knew that Ditlev would be in jail for a long time. I walked over to him. He didn't recognize me at first, so I introduced myself again. "I'm Christiane," I told him. "Babs's and Stella's friend." That got his attention. He asked me if I wanted to go with him and offered me 2 quarters. We used the same currency, and that was nice. In fact, it was his best quality. 2/4 was good pay, about 80 marks when converted into cash. I negotiated some extra change for cigarettes, soda, and stuff, and off we went. Heinz stopped at a corner on the way to buy some dope because I guess his reserves had run dry. It was kind of funny to see this accountant-type guy skulking in the shadows with the dealers. But he knew what he was doing. He had a reliable dealer here who always got him really good shit. I had the itch pretty bad and could feel the withdrawal symptoms coming on. I would have preferred to shoot up right then and there in the car. But Heinz wasn't offering. On the way to his apartment, he insisted on taking me to the stationery store that he owned, at street level. When we got there, he pulled open a desk drawer and showed me some photos he had taken. Just some trashy nude pictures of at least a dozen girls or so. Sometimes their whole body was in the photo, other times it was just a close-up. It was like being in a gynecologist's office. And all I could think was, you sad, pathetic asshole. In the meantime, I was still fixated on the dope in his pockets. I only started paying attention to the photos again when I recognized Stella and Babsy. Great photos, I said. But now let's get down to business. I need a shot. We went upstairs to his apartment. He gave me my dope and also brought a tablespoon out for cooking it up. He apologized that he was out of teaspoons. They'd all been taken by the other girls who had been over. I banged in the shot, and then he brought me a bottle of non-alcoholic beer. After that, he left me alone for 15 minutes. He had enough experience with junkies to know that they needed 15 minutes of quiet afterward. His apartment didn't look like it belonged to a businessman. And that's what Babsy and Stella had always said he was. In the old living room hutch I found some of his ties along with cheesy porcelain trinkets and a bunch of empty Chianti bottles. The curtains, which were yellow with dirt, were drawn, so that nobody could look into his shabby surroundings. There were 2 old sofas pushed together against the wall, and that's where we hooked up, on top of an old checkered wool blanket that had fringes at the end. There weren't any linens around here. This Heinz guy wasn't that rude or mean or anything, but he definitely got on your nerves. That was his main talent. He was so persistent and so annoying that in the end I agreed to sleep with him so that he would finally leave me in peace and let me go home. He also insisted that I enjoy it myself, and so I pretended that I did. At least he paid well. After that, I became Heinz's regular girl, just like Stella and Babsy had been. At first, I thought that the arrangement was really practical and convenient because he saved me a lot of time. I didn't have to hang around the park for hours just for one tiny snort, I didn't have to wait around at Zoo Station for Johns, and I didn't even have to go to the corner to score my dope. So now I was able to take care of the house again, tend to the pigeons, and get all my shopping done without all the old stress. I spent almost every afternoon with Heinz, and to tell the truth, I didn't really mind him anymore. He loved me, in his strange way. He constantly told me that he loved me, and I had to tell him that I loved him back because he would get mad if I didn't reciprocate. He was super jealous and was always afraid that I was still working Zoo Station. But all in all, he was pretty nice. He was the only person left that I could still talk to. Dittelf was in jail. Bernd was in jail. Babsy was in rehab. Stella had somehow fallen off the face of the earth. My mom didn't want to have anything to do with me. And as for my dad, I had to constantly lie to him. Every sentence that I told him was a lie of one kind or another. Heinz was the only one I could be honest with, the only one who I didn't have to hide things from. The one exception to that rule, of course, was the fact that we couldn't ever talk honestly about our own relationship. Sometimes, when Heinz held me, it just felt so good. I got the feeling that he respected me and that I meant something to him. Who else respected me? When we weren't on his grungy couch, I felt more like his daughter than his lover. But he really did have a talent for annoying people, and that problem only got worse the more time you spent with him. He wanted me to be with him constantly. I had to help him in his store and was supposed to be there when he wanted to show me off to his so-called friends. In truth, he didn't have any friends. The amount of time that Heinz required of me was making my dad suspicious again. It was putting me under pressure. My dad was constantly snooping around in my stuff, so I was careful not to bring anything that would be at all suspicious into the apartment. I encoded all the phone numbers and addresses that were connected to drugs or prostitution. For example, Heinz lived on Forest Street. So I drew some trees in my notebook. House number and phone number I convened to currency figures. The phone number 395-47731 wrote out as 3.95 marks plus 47 pfennigs plus 73 pfennigs. And then I also worked out the answer like a good girl. So I hadn't totally abandoned math in the end. One day, Heinz solved the mystery of where Stella had gone. She was in jail. I hadn't heard anything about it before he told me, since I didn't spend any time at zoo station anymore. Heinz was pretty shocked by the news. Not because of Stella, but because of the cops. He was terrified of them. He was afraid that Stella would turn him in. In the course of this conversation, I learned that a while back the police had begun to put together a case against Heinz, on suspicion of seducing minors and some other stuff. Up to that point, he hadn't let it bother him, even though he had in fact been previously convicted. He said he had the best lawyer in Berlin. But now he was scared to death by the thought that Stella would tell the police about how he paid the girls in dope. I was shocked, too. And like Heinz, it wasn't Stella that I was worried about, but me. If they put Stella in jail at 14, then they certainly wouldn't hesitate to do the same to me. That was not my idea of a good time. I called Narcanon to give Babsy the bad news. We usually talked on the phone about once a day. Up to that point, she'd agreed that the withdrawal therapy at Narcanon was okay, although it should be noted that she had already slipped out twice to get a quick fix. But when I called in, they told me that Babsy was in the West End hospital with jaundice. It seemed like Babsy and I tended to stumble over a lot of the same obstacles. She was just as fragile as I was. As soon as we started withdrawing, we both got jaundice. Babsy had tried to get clean countless times before. The last time she'd even gone all the way to Tübingen with a drug counselor to begin a therapy program there. But she'd chickened out at the last second because of how strict the program was supposed to be. We always kept a close eye on each other. We could always tell how run down the other one was because we were usually dealing with the same issues, the same illnesses. The first thing the next morning, I left to visit her at the West End hospital. I took the subway with Janie to Theodore Hughes Place, and then we ran through the district of West End. It's a really cool area. Beautiful villas and lots of trees. I had no idea that a place like this existed in Berlin. It made me realize that when it really came down to it, I didn't know the city that well after all. I knew how to get around in Gropiusstadt and the surrounding areas, and I'd spent a lot of time in the little quarter of Kreuzberg where my mom's apartment was, and I knew my way around the 4 main drug markets, but that was it. It was pouring. Janie and I were soaked. But we were both in a great mood. We were happy about having all these trees around us, and I was especially happy that I would get a chance to see Babsy soon. After we got to the hospital, we ran into a little problem that I hadn't quite anticipated. Janie wasn't allowed inside. But one of the doormen was great. He offered to take Janie into his little kiosk and look after her. I asked him the way to the ward where Babsy was, and when I got there, I asked the first doctor I saw where she was. He said, "Well, that's what we'd like to know, too." Babsy had taken off the day before. He said that if she did any drugs right now it could be fatal because she hadn't yet recovered from the jaundice, and her liver wouldn't be able to take much more. Janie and I walked back to the subway. I considered the fact that my own liver was probably just as poor off as Babsy's. Our lives already had so many parallels. I missed Babsy and I longed to see her. I'd forgotten all about our fights. We both needed each other, now more than ever. I wanted to let her talk about whatever she wanted to talk about and for as long as she wanted to talk. And I wanted to convince her to check herself back into the hospital. But then I sobered up again. I knew that Babsy wouldn't go back to the hospital after she'd been on H again for 2 days. I knew what I would do myself. I wouldn't have gone back either. She and I were so damn similar. But I didn't know where I should be looking for her. She was either flitting around on one of the drug scenes or working the streets, or she was with one of her regulars. I didn't have time to look for her everywhere because my dad was due to make his checkup calls home. So I did what any self-respecting addict would do, I looked after myself. I went home. I still had dope from Heinz, so I didn't have any reason to head out to the streets or to the station. The next morning, I went downstairs to get the paper, the B.Z.41. Ever since my mom had stopped confronting me with all the death notices, I'd started buying the paper myself, and without even thinking about it, I still searched the paper for news about heroin victims before I read anything else. As the heroin-related deaths increased, the write-ups got smaller and smaller. But the more I read, the more people I was able to recognize. A lot of them had been found with a needle still stuck in their arm. So on that particular morning, I was making myself toast with jam while flipping through the paper. On the first page was a headline in giant print, "She was only 14. I didn't even need to read the rest of the article. I knew right away. I'd had a feeling it was coming. Babsy was gone. I don't know what I was feeling. It felt like nothing. It felt like I was dead, like I was reading my own obituary. I went into the bathroom and shot up. That helped me to cry a little. I wasn't sure if I was crying about Babsy or myself. I sat on my bed and lit a cigarette, and then I read the rest of the article. It was written up like a sensational entertainment piece. When they found her, the syringe was still stuck in the vein of her left hand. The name of this young girl, Babette D., 14, a student from Schoenberg. Dead. The youngest victim yet in Berlin's heroin epidemic. Najia, 30, the acquaintance who found her, explained to the police that he'd picked the girl up at the Sounder Club on Genfina Street. Since she didn't have a place to stay, he took her to his apartment. Babette is the 46th drug victim in Berlin this year. And so on. Pleasantly callous, and so simplistic. In the papers, every junkie was the same. Even the magazines got in on the story because up to that point she was still the youngest victim of a heroin overdose in all of Germany. Around noon I'd recovered enough to experience a feeling of intense, wild rage. I was convinced that some slimy dealer had tried to make a few extra marks by selling Babsy a bag of dope that was laced with some cheap poison, maybe even strychnine. Every month, more and more strychnine found its way into the dope that was sold on the streets. I took the subway and went to the police. I ran straight into Mrs. Chip's office without knocking and started to just vent. I told her everything I knew about corrupt dealers and about pimps who were in the heroin business and about the Sound. Most of it didn't seem to interest her very much. At the end of it all, she just repeated her standard goodbye, "Well then, until next time, Christiane." I thought the cops didn't give a shit if someone sold dirty dope. They were just glad when they could cross another addict off their lists. I swore to myself to find Babsy's murderer on my own. The guy who lived in the apartment where Babsy was found seemed innocent enough. He was an okay guy. I knew him pretty well from before. He was a little weird, but kind of funny, and he had a lot of cash. He liked to surround himself with very young girls. He'd once given me a ride through the city in his sports car, invited me to dinner, and then given me some money. But he would only sleep with a girl if she was actually interested in him. So it never went any further with me. I wasn't interested. Even though the guy was a businessman, he never seemed to realize that all the young girls he chased after were also running their own kind of business. I decided to go to Kurfürstenstrasse, where there was never any shortage of girls or clients. My plan was to make as much money as I could so that I could buy dope from all kinds of sleazy dealers and then test it to figure out who was selling the deadly shit that was killing all these girls. But then I just flitted around the drug scene, scored dope from a couple of guys, and succeeded only in getting super high. It wouldn't have made a difference anyway. Nobody seemed to know who had sold Babsy her last shot. Obviously, my plan to find Babsy's killer was just an excuse to get as high as I could. It was a way of taking my foot off the brakes. I was telling myself, you've got to find that scumbag, even if it kills you. That's the point when I stopped worrying about how anything would look to anyone else. I just wanted to get high. I didn't bother putting on an act for my dad anymore. He'd known something was up for a long time already. I think he was just waiting for proof. And he wouldn't have to wait long to get it. One night when I'd used up my morning's supply of H prematurely and couldn't get away, because my dad was home, I called Heinz and told him to meet me in Gropiusstadt. My dad surprised Heinz and me in front of the Hungry Woodpecker. Heinz barely managed to clear out in time. But after a determined search, my dad found the dope that Heinz had given me. I confessed everything right away, including the developments with Heinz. I didn't have it in me to lie anymore. My dad forced me to make a date with Heinz for the next day. We set up a meeting at the park, where he was supposed to give me dope again. Then my dad called the cops, told them everything, and demanded that they arrest Heinz during his meeting with me. The cops told him that they'd have to conduct a real raid at the park, and that sort of thing was impossible to organize on such short notice. They weren't that interested in going after this kind of cradle robber, as my dad referred to Heinz, because it just created too much trouble for them. But of course I was hugely relieved that I didn't have to play the role of a police informant. I always thought that my dad would beat me half to death if he found out how much I was getting away with. But it wasn't like that at all. He seemed desperate. Almost like my mom. He spoke to me very gently. He'd finally figured out that you can't quit H just like that, even if you seriously want to. However, he was still hopeful that somehow he'd be able to help me work through it. The next day, he locked me into the apartment again and took my dog, Janie, with him. I never saw Janie again after that. I started going into withdrawal in a very bad way. By the middle of the day, I already felt like I was dying. That's when Heinz called. I begged him to bring me some dope. Since he couldn't even get into the building without a key, I came up with the idea of letting down a rope out the window. I finally convinced Heinz to do it, but in exchange he wanted me to write him a love letter and lower the letter down to him along with a pair of my panties. He never gave out dope without getting something in return. After all, he was a businessman. So I looked through the apartment for anything that resembled a rope. Kitchen string, plastic laundry line, a belt from a bathrobe, etc. I had to tie dozens of knots and keep testing the length, until the makeshift knotted rope could reach down to the ground from the 11th floor. Then I scribbled out the letter as best I could without the aid of any dope. Heinz announced himself with the signature doorbell ring that we'd agreed upon. I grabbed a pair of panties, a pair that I'd embroidered myself, out of the wardrobe, stuffed it, along with the letter, into the plastic cover for my hairdryer, and sent the mail down through the window. It worked. At the bottom, Heinz put in the dope. Meanwhile, a bunch of people had started paying attention to this strange little game of ours. But it didn't seem to faze Heinz, and I definitely didn't care what other people thought. I just wanted to get high. But when a little boy leaned out of a window on the 9th floor and tried to grab the string, I lost it. I screamed at him and swung the rope away. I was terrified about losing my heroin. After an eternity, I finally managed to haul it all inside, and I was just about to cook up the dope when the phone rang. It was Heinz. There'd been a misunderstanding. He wanted a pair of panties that hadn't been washed yet. I had the dope and, in a way, I didn't care about anything else. But I knew that he would keep at it if I didn't give in, so I reached down to the bottom of the hamper and threw the oldest pair of panties I could find out of the window. It landed in a shrub. At first Heinz ran away, but then he snuck back to fish his prize out of the bushes. Heinz was a total perv. As I found out later, while I was lowering my panties down to him with a rope, he already had an arrest warrant out on him. The cops just hadn't had the time to come and pick him up yet. And his lawyer had already told him how bad things looked. But when it came to girls, Heinz didn't care. He would risk everything. I had to appear as a witness at his trial, and I told the truth. Honestly, Heinz didn't matter to me any more than any other customer. But despite that, it wasn't easy for me to testify against him. I felt sorry for him. He wasn't any worse than my other customers. I just felt bad for him because he was literally addicted to girls. If anything, he should have been put in a psychiatric ward rather than in a jail. Heinz's dope just about lasted for the couple of days that my dad kept me locked up. Then, when he left the front door unlocked one day, I took off. I managed to bum around on people's couches for an entire week before my dad found me and took me home again. I was sure that he was going to give me a serious beating. But instead, he just seemed to sink deeper into his own brand of despair. I told him that I couldn't do this by myself. There was no way anyone could if she was completely alone all day. Babsy was dead. Dittelf was in jail. Stella was in jail. I told him about how Stella was already rotting away in jail, at only 14. I'd heard all about it from a girl who used to share a cell with her and had since been set free. Stella was consumed with suicidal thoughts. The only support she was getting was from some female terrorists who were being held in the same jail. Stella had talked to Monica Berberic from the IF-43 a couple of times and had become a fan of hers. A lot of the addicts thought the terrorists were awesome. Some of them had even attempted to join a terrorist group themselves before they washed out on H. When the Schleyer 44 kidnapping happened, even I thought it seemed pretty cool. That being said, I was still opposed to any kind of violence. I could never have hurt anyone myself. But all the people in the IF seemed like they knew what was going on behind the scenes. And maybe they were right. Maybe you needed to resort to violence if you wanted to make a difference in a society like this that was already so totally fucked up. Stella's story had a profound effect on my dad. He wanted to get her out of jail and adopt her. I had convinced him that together with Stella I could make it. I could quit heroin and stay clean. That's what he was hoping for, too. It was idiotic, but how could he have known any better? My dad didn't always do the right thing during the time that I lived with him, I'm sure. But still, he did what he could. Just like my mom. So my dad barged through the doors of the youth welfare office like a bull chasing red. He finally wore them down and managed to pry Stella out of jail. She was a complete and utter wreck, both physically and emotionally. She was even worse off now than she was before she went to jail. I was still using when she came to live with us, even though I'd planned on getting clean, and I got her to shoot up again with me on the very first day. She would have started using again anyway. We only talked seriously about withdrawing during the first few days. Between the two of us, we figured out a way to get around my dad's rules. We divided up all the chores and then went out and worked the streets in shifts, sticking to the Kurfürstenstrasse, waiting for cars to pull over. I didn't care about anything anymore, so getting into strange cars with strange men no longer horrified me. There were 4 of us at the corner of Kurfürstenstrasse and Genfiner streets. Besides Stella and me, there were the 2 Tinas. Apart from their names, they had little else in common. One of them was still a year younger than me, so only just 14. We always worked in pairs, never less than that at least. When one of us drove off with a customer, the other would write down the license plate number, and we made sure that the driver saw us do it to stop him from getting any funny ideas. That was also a protection against pimps. We weren't scared of cops. The cop cars would drive by, and some of them would even wave. One of them was even a regular customer of mine. He was a strange guy with a lot of funny ideas. He wanted to feel like he was loved. And it was always a chore to explain to him that prostitution was work, love had nothing to do with it. He wasn't the only one who was like that either. A lot of them wanted someone to talk to. It was always the same script. How did such a pretty girl like me end up on the street? I really didn't need to do that, and so on. Those were the comments that really got on my nerves. I hated it when people talked like they also wanted to save me. I got real marriage proposals. And all the while they knew full well that they were only taking advantage of our misery, the misery of the addicts, to satisfy their own desires. They were a bunch of fucking liars. They said they could help us, when they already had more than enough problems of their own. As a general rule, these were mostly guys who couldn't even manage to deal with professional hookers. These guys had difficulties with women in general, and as a result they preferred young girls. They talked about how frustrated they were with their wives and their families and their whole lives. They complained about how nothing ever changed. Sometimes they even seemed to be a bit jealous of us, of the fact that we were still so young. They wanted to know what we thought was cool, what we were into, what kind of music we liked, what clothes we wore, and what kind of slang we used. One guy, almost 50, was dead set on smoking some weed because he was convinced that that's what all the young people were doing now. So in return for some extra cash, I hiked with him over half of Berlin to find a dealer who had some pot. I'd never noticed it before, and it seemed crazy, but it was true. You could get heroin everywhere, at every corner, but it was almost impossible to find any marijuana. It took us almost 3 hours to find a dealer who had some. After this customer of mine had smoked his joint, he was ecstatic. It was like his dreams had come true just because he'd managed to smoke some pot. Our customers, who were all pretty bizarre in one way or another, broke up into 2 distinct sets. Some were just weird, but the others were malicious. One of them always insisted that I knock on the steel rod in his leg, which he'd had since a motorcycle accident. And another guy arrived with an official document of some kind or other. It had a stamp on it, and it said that he was infertile. So obviously he didn't want to use any condoms. The worst of them was the guy who pretended to from a modeling agency and wanted to take some sample pictures. In the car, he pulled out a gun and demanded service without pay. The ones I liked best were the college students who came trudging over to us on foot. They were pretty inhibited, as a rule. But at least you could talk to them. They were mostly interested in talking about how fucked up our society was. Those were the only ones whose apartments I would go to. With the others, I'd do it in the car or in a hotel room. The room would cost the customer an extra 10 marks minimum. And they'd put up an extra cot for us, as we weren't allowed to use the freshly made up double bed. The hotels were the most depressing places ever. Stella and I communicated through coded messages on the advertising pillars, the iconic Berliner Lit for Saul 45, or empty poster walls. This way we always knew when we were changing shifts, what the other one was up to, and what my dad had in store for us when we got home, what new system he was going to implement to keep us under control. Even I felt run down and depressed. I sometimes walked into a store that called itself Teen Challenge. They'd set up shop suspiciously close by the Sound, not to mention the Kurfürstenstrasse, the street where all the teen prostitutes hung out, and they were hoping to convert kids just like us. Once you were in their shop, they handed you brochures and books about little, young prostitutes and child addicts in the United States. These were all kids who'd been saved by Teen Challenge and turned onto the righteous path of God. I'd unload my troubles there while drinking tea and eating sandwiches. Then, when they started talking about our dear Lord, I just took off. It's funny, because when you stop to think about it, the Teen Challenge people were just as interested in taking advantage of us as everybody else was. They tried to reel us in, because that's when we were the most vulnerable. Right next to their basement shop there was a communist group that had managed to set up a storefront. Sometimes I'd stop and read their posters in their shop window. They wanted to completely change society. I liked the idea. But their slogans didn't do anything for me in my situation either. Then I'd stroll by the shop windows of the big furniture stores located nearby on the Kurfürstenstrasse. But after a while, I couldn't stop myself from thinking about all of my old hopes and dreams with Dittelf. And that just made me feel worse. At that point, I was pretty much at the bottom of the heap, even for a long-time addict. If nothing was happening on the street and I wasn't getting any customers, I turned to crime. Just small stuff because I wasn't a born criminal and didn't have the nerves for it. Even some junkie pals invited me to come along on a robbery. I chickened out. My most impressive deed to date, which required almost an entire bottle of vermouth beforehand, was when I smashed in a car window with some brass knuckles and stole a boombox. Other than that, I mostly just helped people transport or hide stolen goods. I also worked as a mule, transporting stolen merchandise for lifetime criminals. I put the stolen stuff into lockers at zoo station and picked it up again for them, too. For that I got 20 marks, at most. And when it came down to it, that was even more dangerous than stealing. But I'd totally lost all perspective at that point anyway. At home, I lied to my dad and fought with Stella. I'd made an agreement with Stella that we'd split everything 50-50, the jobs and the dope. That's what caused most of our fights. Because each of us believed that the other was ripping her off. It doesn't get much sadder than that, I don't think. My dad had figured out, of course, what was going on with me. But by that point, he was at a complete loss as to what to do. And so was I. I knew, however, that my parents couldn't do anything to help me anymore. I couldn't handle schnoll any longer, even if I just sat there doing nothing. I also couldn't stand sitting around. I couldn't stand anything anymore. I couldn't fool around with customers, I couldn't relax on the scene with my friends, and I couldn't stand being around my dad. So it had come to this, end of the world doom and gloom. Thoughts of suicide. I recognized this situation, and I knew that it absolutely couldn't go on this way. But I was still too chicken to give myself the golden shot, the overdose. I was still looking for some way out. That's when it occurred to me that I could voluntarily check myself into the asylum. That would be the Bonhoeffer Asylum, or Bonnie's Ranch, as it was called. This was pretty much the last option for a heroin addict. Bonnie's Ranch represented complete and utter horror to every junkie. On the streets, there was a saying, better 4 years in jail than 4 weeks at Bonnie's Ranch. Some addicts who were forcibly admitted to Bonnie's after a breakdown would usually come back with horrific stories of their time there. But, naive as I was, I thought that someone would start paying attention to me there, especially if I checked myself involuntarily and freely submitted myself to this horror. Then the youth welfare office, or whoever, would have to finally notice that I was a teenager who desperately needed help. And that her parents were completely incapable of helping her. The decision to go to Bonnie's Ranch was like a suicide attempt from which I was secretly hoping to wake up again so that everyone would say afterward, "That poor girl. If only we'd taken better care of her. From now on, we'll do better." Once I'd made that decision, I went to see my mom. At first she acted pretty distant. I mean, after all, she'd already written me off. But I couldn't help it. Right away I started crying, really crying. Then I tried to tell her my story, sticking to the truth as best as I could. Then she also started crying, and took me into her arms and didn't let me go. We both cried so long, we cried ourselves happy. My sister was also really happy that I was back. We spent the night together in my old bed. And then, after that, I went into withdrawal again. Another, new withdrawal. I'd lost count of how many withdrawals I'd been through at that point. If withdrawing was an Olympic sport, I probably would have medaled in it. I didn't know anyone else who'd voluntarily gotten clean as many times as I had. And on top of that, I'd done it even though I knew that it wasn't going to make any difference. My mom took time off from work again and brought me what I needed: Valium, wine, pudding, and fruit. On the fourth day, she took me to Bonnie's Ranch. I really truly wanted to go there since I'd realized in the meantime that I would have just started shooting up again right away. As soon as we got there, I was forced to strip naked, and then I was pushed into a bath. They treated me like I was a leper. 2 bathtubs were already occupied by 2 clearly insane old women. I was put into the 3rd tub and was told to scrub myself. I had to do it under supervision. I didn't get my own clothes back afterward. Instead, they gave me a pair of underpants that stretched from my rib cage all the way to my knees and that I had to hold on to if I didn't want them to slide off me. And a pretty old granny nightgown. I was taken to the observation ward, where I was the only one under 60. The ladies there were all very far gone, just totally crazy. There was only one exception. Everyone called her Dolly. Dolly was busy all day with one job or another. All on behalf of the ward. She really made herself useful and relieved the nurses of all sons of work. I talked to her, and she didn't seem insane, she was just a bit slow. I mean her thought process. She'd been there for 15 years. 15 years ago, her brothers and sisters had committed her to Bonnie's Ranch. Apparently, she'd never had any kind of therapy. She'd just always stayed in the observation ward. Maybe because she'd been making herself so useful there. I thought that something was very wrong if someone could be kept on the observation ward for 15 years just because they happened to be a little bit slow. On the first day, wasting no time, a whole team of doctors came in to inspect me. I guess most of the white coats were probably students, who brazenly gave me a once-over as I was standing there in my thin little nightie. The lead physician asked me a few questions, and I answered, very naively, that in a few days I wanted to do a therapy program and then go to a boarding school in Western Germany so that I could eventually take the college entrance exams. He kept just saying, yes, HM, yes, the way I would when talking to a lunatic. When I was back in bed, I remembered a few jokes about lunatics. I wondered if I'd said or done something wrong that gave them the idea that I was yet another frothing maniac who thought he was Napoleon. I was suddenly scared that I'd never be able to leave the observation ward, just like old Dolly, and would have to doze away the rest of my days in my depressing hospital uniform. After 2 days, I was transferred to B ward since I didn't have any withdrawal symptoms anymore. I got my clothes back and was even allowed to eat with a knife and fork again, instead of just with a baby spoon like in the observation ward. In B ward, there were 3 more addicts whom I recognized from the outside world. The 4 of us sat at one table, which one old nut immediately dubbed the terrorists' table. One of the girls, Leon, had already done a lot of jail time. She said that Bonnie's Ranch was much worse than jail because in jail you could easily get some dope, whereas at Bonnie's Ranch it was almost impossible. So far, it was kind of fun on Bonnie's Ranch because there were 4 of us. Still, I was starting to get a little panicky. The doctors wouldn't give me a straight answer as to when I could leave to start a drug therapy program. All they said was, "We'll see," and whatever other platitudes they dispensed to the lunatics on a daily basis. The agreement with my mom and the youth welfare office was that I'd be at Bonnie's Ranch for 4 days, to make sure that I was clean. And then I was supposed to get a spot in a therapy program. But I'd already done the withdrawal by myself and had arrived there almost clean. Nonetheless, nobody was talking about my spot in a therapy program anymore. The big blow came after a couple of days. They brought me a document, which I was supposed to sign, stating I was voluntarily staying in the asylum for 3 months. Of course, I refused to sign and said that I wanted to leave immediately. I'd come here of my own free will and could leave whenever I wanted. Then the supervising doctor came and said that if I didn't sign off on staying for 3 months, he'd commit me to involuntary hospitalization for 6 months. I felt totally conned. I got chills, I was so horrified. The truth hit me like a bolt of lightning. I was completely dependent on these idiotic doctors. I had no idea what kind of diagnosis they were manufacturing for me. They could say I had a severe neurosis or schizophrenia or who knew what. As a patient in an asylum, you didn't have any rights at all. I thought that I was going to become Dolly Z. The worst thing was that I myself wasn't convinced of my own sanity. I already knew that I was neurotic. I had learned through conversation with my drug counselors that an addiction is a neurosis, a compulsive action you can't control. I thought about all the things that I'd done. All those withdrawals I'd gone through, only to start shooting up again as soon as they were over, even though I knew full well that it was the path to my own destruction, and that someday it would lead to my death. I'd fucked up every single thing in my life. I caused other people pain, including my mom. That wasn't normal. So I was kind of a maniac when you thought about it. Now it was just a matter of figuring out how I could hide my craziness from the doctors and nurses. The nurses all treated me like an idiot, the same way they treated all the other patients in the ward. I pulled myself together to an extent that I could hardly believe, and restrained my own impulses so that I stopped reacting in my usual aggressive way when they provoked me. When the doctors came and asked questions, I tried to give them the answers that they wanted to hear, despite the fact that it went completely against my nature to do so. I tried desperately to hide my real self and appear to be someone who was completely and totally normal. And once the doctors were gone, I was always convinced that I'd made a mistake and said the wrong thing. I was afraid that they'd seen through me and thought I was crazy for sure. The only thing they offered me in terms of rehabilitation was knitting. I couldn't have cared less about knitting, and I didn't think it would help. In front of the windows were iron bars, of course. But these weren't the normal kind of bars like you'd see in jail. No, these were nice, ornately curved bars, because this was no jail, obviously. But after a while, I realized that, if you twisted yourself just so, you could get your head through the curves in the bars and get a good look at the outside world. Sometimes I stood there for hours, the iron bars around my neck, just looking around. The season was changing to autumn, the leaves were turning yellow and red, the sun was low in the sky, and, for an hour each afternoon, it shone directly through 2 trees right in front of the window. Sometimes I would tie one of the tin cups to a length of wool thread, let it dangle out of the window, and bang against the house wall. Or I'd try all afternoon to pull a branch close to the window using the wool thread, in order to get at a leaf. At night I thought, if you weren't crazy before, you be certainly gone crazy now. This was the place for it. I wasn't even allowed to go into the little garden to walk in circles with the grandmas. Even a terrorist has a right to go outside once a day. Not me though. I was considered a flight risk. And I was. Damn right. In an old cupboard, I found a soccer ball. I kept kicking it again and again against a locked glass door, hoping that it would break the glass. But then they took the soccer ball away. Then I rammed the glass with my head. But of course it was made of reinforced glass. I felt like a wild animal in a tiny cage. Like a tiger, I prowled along the walls for hours. Once, I thought I couldn't stand it anymore. I just had to run. And so I just started running. Always up and down the hallway. Until I couldn't take another step and literally collapsed. I got hold of a knife, and at nightly on and I scratched and scraped at the putty of a window that was locked but not barred. The glass pane didn't move an inch though. The next night, we took a bed apart and tried to break the bars of an open window. Before we started on this plan, we intimidated the old ladies in the room to such a degree that they didn't dare make a peep. Some of them actually thought we were terrorists. The plan didn't work though since the bars were so strong. And anyway, we made so much noise that the night watch caught on pretty soon. The way I was acting pretty much eliminated any chance that I would ever get free of this insane asylum. I kept sliding further and further downhill. The only thing that seemed to be doing okay without drugs was my body. In other words, I got chubby. But my skin was pasty, and my face looked at once sunken and puffy. In the mirror, I looked like someone who'd been at Bonnie's ranch for 15 years already. I hardly slept. That was no surprise. Almost every night there was some huge commotion on the ward. And I also didn't want to miss a chance to escape. Although it all seemed so hopeless, I still made myself look nice every morning, like I was ready to go out. I brushed my hair with incredible patience, put on makeup, and slipped on my nicest jacket. At one point, someone finally came by from the youth welfare office. Like everyone else, he just said, "Okay, well, let's see." But he was at least able to tell me where Ditlev was being held and his case number. As soon as he left, I sat down and wrote just page after page after page. And as soon as I handed in my first letter, I started to write another one. Finally, I was able to talk to someone again. But still, I had to watch what I said since all the letters were reviewed. Probably at Bonnie's, but definitely at the jail. So I had to diligently continue constructing my string of lies in the letters. I had no interest in drugs. I felt no cravings. And so on. I got a whole pile of letters from Ditlev, too, all at once. He wrote that he'd fucked up royally when he stole those Eurochecks from that customer. But that he'd only done it so that he could go to Paris to quit. He'd wanted to surprise me with it because the two of us could have never done it together. Ditlev wrote that he'd be released soon, and then he'd go into a therapy program. I wrote that I'd also be going into therapy soon, too. And we both wrote that after our therapy programs we'd get an apartment together. So once again, we were busy cooking up our imaginary paradise where we'd live together after all of our problems had been solved. But when I wasn't writing to Ditlev, I was convinced that I'd spend the rest of my life right here at Bonnie's ranch. But eventually, a real chance opened up for me. An old infection started giving me some problems again, and I told the doctor repeatedly that I needed to go to a hospital for an operation because the pain was getting to be more than I could stand. Then one morning I was taken to the Rudolf Virchow Hospital, escorted by guards who were instructed to keep a close eye on me. After the medical exam, they decided to keep me in the hospital because it was really quite bad. I'd already gotten some solid information about how to escape from there. I finagled a park pass for myself, which wasn't easy, trust me. Not if you're an addict. But I had a trick up my sleeve. I walked up to a really sweet nurse and told her that I wanted to take one of the old ladies for a walk. She was stuck in her chair, so I would help to push her around in a wheelchair. The nurse didn't suspect a thing and thought it was incredibly sweet of me. I grabbed one of the old ladies, who thought I couldn't sweeter. I pushed her out into the park and said, "Wait a sec, Grandma. I'll be right back." And a few seconds later, I was over the fence. I ran to the Amrama Street subway station and then made my way over toward the zoo. I'd never felt so free in my entire life. I dove immediately back into the scene at the university cafeteria. I flitted around a bit, getting a sense of what was happening, and then sat down next to three young dudes on a bench. I told them that I'd just escaped from Bonnie's. That impressed them. I was dying for a shot. One of the boys was a dealer. I asked if I could barter with him or have some on credit. He said I could if I'd help him negotiate some deals. I agreed. So he gave me some, and right away I gave myself a shot in the cafeteria bathroom. It was less than an eighth, and the dope wasn't that good, but it still improved my mood. I still had a good grasp on things and had my head on pretty straight. Which was a good thing because I was still supposed to negotiate for this guy. He was still kind of young, and I knew him a little from the pot scene at the park. He was still in school, about 16. It was obvious to me that he didn't have much experience with dealing, otherwise, he wouldn't have given me the shot before I had paid him back with some work. Suddenly, I sensed undercover cops all over the place, just outside the cafeteria. The guy didn't notice a thing. I had to go right up to him and whisper, "Cops," before he finally caught on. I started walking slowly in the direction of the zoo, and he padded after me. When a junkie came toward me from the station, I said, "Better stop right here. There's a raid going on at the cafeteria. But I can get you some first-class stuff." The boy dealer came up at once and actually took all of his dope out of his pocket and said that the guy was welcome to try some. I couldn't fucking believe my eyes. There's a raid going on a block behind us, and this moron pulls his whole supply of dope right out of his pocket. Right away, two cops, who'd obviously been lying in wait, trotted up to us. Running made no sense. This rookie of a dealer was just throwing his little baggies all around him. Purple foil fluttered everywhere. Apparently, he thought that he could pin it on me or the other guy and kept blabbing about how he had nothing to do with it. We had to lean up against a VW, arms up in the air, and were searched for weapons, even though none of us was older than 16. The asshole cop felt me up while he was at it. But I stayed totally cool. After all, I'd had my fix, and after Bonnie's, nothing could rattle me. I immediately adopted the persona of the polite and well-brought-up child. That prompted them to be very friendly when taking down my personal information. One of them said to me, "Listen girl, you're barely 15, what the heck are you doing here?" I said, "Window shopping," and lit up a cigarette. That got him angry. "Hey, throw that butt away. That's poison at your age." So I had to throw away the cigarette. We were taken to the police station at Ernst Reuter Place and put in a cell. The wannabe dealer immediately came unglued and shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" I took off my jacket, rolled it into a pillow, lay down on the cot, and dozed off. An arrest like this wasn't about to faze me. I wasn't worried about the cops finding out where I'd come from, about how I'd escaped from Bonnie's. I was confident that I hadn't been reported missing yet. After 2 hours, they let me go again, and I went back to the university cafeteria. On the way there, my emotions caught up with me. I started to bawl. So once again, I'd shot up some smack as soon as I could after a withdrawal. And I didn't know where to go next. I couldn't possibly show up at my mom's place with pupils the size of pinpoints and say, "Hey mom, I'm back." I ran away. "Could you make me some dinner?" I went to the drug counseling office in the old cafeteria of the technical university. There were some cool guys there, and they made me feel a lot better and gave me the confidence I needed to call my mom. My mom was reassured to know that I had called from the university. On the way home, I noticed that I had a fever. By the time I got into bed, it was over 1040 F. My mom called the emergency hotline because I was becoming delirious. The doctor, when he came over, wanted to give me an injection, but that idea terrified me because I was supposed to get the shot in my butt. I could stick a needle into my arm 2 or 3 times a day, but when the doctor stuck the needle into my butt, I freaked out. The fever started to subside immediately, but I was completely drained. Bonnie's ranch did me in, physically and mentally. When I was able to get up again after 3 days, I went back right away to the drug counseling office at the university. On the way there, I had to pass through the heroin scene outside the dining hall. But I ran right past it without looking left or right. For a whole week, I went to that drug advice place every day. When I was there, I could finally talk about what was on my mind. It was the first time that I'd come to a place where I was allowed to unload absolutely everything. Up until now, I'd always been talked at. My mom had always talked at me, my dad, the Narcanon people, everyone. But here at the university, I was supposed to do the talking and figure out myself what was going on with me. I was still spending all my time with the advisors when my face began to turn yellow again. When I ran into some people I knew in front of the university, they literally ran away from me. "Get the fuck out of here," they yelled at me. "And take your jaundice with you." I couldn't believe it. I guess I'd been trying to ignore reality, but here it was, jaundice again. This was crazy. Every time I'd stayed clean for a while and dared to regain some hope, I wound up suffering from some typical addict's disease. Even the abdominal pains became unbearable. My mom took me to the clinic at Stiglitz. I wanted to go to Stiglitz because they had a really good kitchen there. So I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, doubled over with pain. Any nurse who walked by could tell by my yellow face what was wrong with me. But none of them did anything. The waiting room was full of people, including kids. I could have infected all of them if I were contagious. After 2 hours, I started to walk. I had to stick to the wall because I was so weak and in so much pain. I wanted to ask the way to the isolation ward, and when a doctor passed me, I told him, "I need a bed. I don't want to infect all these people here. I have jaundice, obviously." He said that he couldn't help me with that, and that I first had to go through the intake process. So back I went. When I finally had a chance to speak, I told my doctor that I had contracted the jaundice from shooting heroin. She looked back at me, cold as ice, and said, "Sorry, but we're not responsible for cases like yours." The thing is, nobody wants to be responsible for the addicts. So back into a taxi we go. My mom was furious with the doctors as a result of their refusal to help. The next morning, she took me to Rudolf Virchow Hospital. I wasn't happy about that at all since I'd escaped from there once already. A young resident physician came to take a blood sample. Right away I showed him the state of my arms. He wouldn't ever be able to get a needle in my veins. This is where I have a thrombosis. That vein is totally knotted up anyway. You'll have to take one that's below it. Not straight down with the needle but from a side angle, otherwise you won't get through. The poor guy, now totally unsure of himself, of course, stuck the needle into a completely knotted up vein. He pulled and pulled, but no blood came, and due to the vacuum in the syringe, the needle literally exploded right back out of my arm. The next few times, he asked me where to stick the needle first. I slept for 2 days straight. The jaundice wasn't contagious. On the 4th day, the liver tests came back okay. There wasn't any more urine in my blood, or not much, and my face was slowly coming back to its natural color. I had to call the people at the university's drug advice office every day, and I did. I hoped to get a spot in a therapy program there very soon. And then I got a huge surprise. Ditlev had been released from jail. My mom brought him along on the next visiting day, a Sunday. Well, as you can imagine, it was a whirlwind: love, hugs, kisses, bliss. We wanted to have some time alone, so we went outside into the hospital park. It was as if we'd never been apart. No sooner had we walked out than we were riding in the subway again, bound for Zoo Station. A small coincidence played a part in that decision. While outside, we ran straight into an old acquaintance of ours, Wilhelm, who'd recently struck gold. He was living with a very prominent doctor and author who not only gave him plenty of cash but also paid for him to go to a private school. So right away, Wilhelm bought us a couple of shots. I came back to the hospital for dinner. The next afternoon, Ditlev returned. This time we had some real difficulties scoring dope, so I wasn't back at the hospital until 10:30 that night. Meanwhile, my dad had also tried visiting me since he was flying to Thailand the next day. My mom had that desperate look on her face again when she came by. I felt like a piece of shit. And then my drug counselor also stopped in and said that I was a helpless case. I swore to myself and everyone else that I was serious about quitting. Ditlev cried also and said it was all his fault. Then he also went to the drug counselors. And when he returned on Sunday, he had a spot in a therapy program for the next day. I said, "I'm so happy for you that you got that spot. Now everything will turn out okay. I'll get a spot, too. We'll do it together, I'll make it. We won't fuck things up again." We went into the hospital park again, and I said, "Let's just go to the zoo real quick. I need to get a book from over there, the third part of a trilogy. I've already read the first two parts, and my mom couldn't find the last installment anywhere." Ditlev said, "Yeah, right. Why do you need to go to the zoo to buy a stupid book? Why don't you just come right out and say it? You want a fix?" I was super annoyed that Ditlev was suddenly pretending to be all high and mighty and on the pious path to clean living. I wasn't even thinking about the dope. I just wanted to get part 3 of the Death's Head Moon series. So I said, "Stop being so self-righteous. You don't know what I'm thinking. And you don't even have to come along, if you don't want to." But of course Ditlev came with me. In the subway, we fell back into our old routine. Right away I started in on some old ladies, getting them all upset and annoyed. This was, as always, very embarrassing to Ditlev, so he moved to the back of the subway car. So then, just like always, I yelled back at him from the other end of the train, "Hey dipshit, don't pretend you don't know me. You're not any better than I am. Get back here." But then I got a nosebleed again. I'd been getting nosebleeds for a couple of weeks, every time I went underground to take a train. I was already feeling pissy, and now I had to keep wiping that damn blood off my face, too. Luckily, I was able to find the book I was looking for at the zoo. I was feeling better and said to Ditlev, "Let's just walk around a bit before we go back. This is your last day of freedom." The heroin scene at Zoo Station acted like a magnet on us. Stella was there and both of the teeners. Stella flipped out when she saw me again, she was so happy. But the two teeners were both in withdrawal and doing really badly. They'd been on Kurfürstenstrasse with Stella but forgot that it was Sunday. And on Sundays, Kurfürstenstrasse is dead. That's when the customers spend time with wives and kids instead of creeping along Kurfürstenstrasse in there. I was kind of glad to have escaped all that shit. Not to live with the constant anxiety of going into withdrawal, and not having to deal with customers. I hadn't had any contact with any Johns for weeks. I was feeling superior to the others, I was really happy, even cocky. I realized that this was probably the first time I'd been able to hang around Zoo Station without craving a shot. We were standing at the bus stop near the subway station. Next to us were two Turkish guys who kept winking at me. Despite the jaundice, I probably looked the freshest of all four of us since I'd been relatively clean for a while. Also, I wasn't wearing any of the usual street clothes. I'd borrowed some clothes from my sister and was dressed in the normal teenage style. I didn't want to look like an addict anymore. I'd even had my hair cut while I was in the hospital. The two guys didn't stop winking. So I asked the two teeners if they wanted me to set something up for them. Even if you just get 40 marks out of it, I told them, you can at least share a quarter. The two teeners didn't care about any of the details. They just wanted to score. Feeling on top of the world, I walked up to the two guys and said, "You want the girls? I can ask for you 50 marks. Capito." I pointed to the teeners. They grinned stupidly and said, "No. You. We fuck you, at hotel." I was completely in control. Without being at all aggressive, I told them bluntly, "Nope, that's not happening. But you'll like these girls. They're young and cheap. Only 50 marks." The younger of the teeners had just recently turned 14. The men were stubborn though. And when I looked at the two teeners, I could understand their thinking. The teeners didn't look very appetizing now that they were in full withdrawal. I went back to the girls and told them that the deal was off. But then the devil got inside of me. I took Stella off to the side and said to her, "The two teeners won't be able to manage any customers in the state that they are in. Especially not these guys. Let's go with them. Well, get them going, and then the teeners can come and finish them off. They're used to fucking customers anyway. We'll ask for 100 marks and buy half a gram." Stella was on board right away, despite the fact that we'd always said that we'd never sink so low as to sleep with these foreign types. So I went back over to the two Turks and suggested our plan, to which they immediately agreed. Only Ditlev resisted. He was pissed and demanded to know why I was hell-bent on prostituting myself. I replied, "Oh, stop it, will you? I'm not doing anything. There's 4 of us." I was telling myself that I was doing it all out of pity for the teeners, and pity may have played a role. But I'm sure I was also interested at the time in getting my hands on some more dope. I told the others that we'd have to go to the Hotel Norma in Nürnberger Street because they had the largest rooms. In the other hotels, they wouldn't let the 6 of us go up to a room together. Then off we went. And suddenly, there was a third guy following us. The other 2 explained, "He friend. Also to hotel." We let that slide for the moment and collected the 100 marks. Stella went off with one of the men to score some dope. She knew a dealer who sold the biggest half-gram packets on the scene. When she got back, all 8 of us went strolling down Toinzian Street together. All of us girls walked in front, arm in arm with Ditlev, and behind us were the Turkish guys. But there was some tension in the air. The 2 teeners wanted the dope right away, and Stella wouldn't hand it over. She was afraid that once they had it, the teeners would just take off. Besides, we wanted to shake off the new guy, who wasn't pan of the original deal. After a minute, Stella turned around, pointed to the third guy, and started in on all 3 of them together. "If that asshole keeps following along, then the whole deal's off." Got it? She had balls anyway, that Stella. The 3 foreigners, however, who had their arms around each other's shoulders in a very collegial fashion, were unimpressed. Stella then suggested we just cut and run. At first, I was all for it because it would be easy in my flat-soled shoes. It was the first time in at least 3 years that I had worn flats, incidentally. I'd borrowed the pair from my sister. But then I had second thoughts. I said, "We'll probably run into them again sometime, and then we'll be in for it." I'd forgotten that this was supposed to be my last afternoon out here. Stella was pissed. She stopped and waited for the foreigners to catch up, and then she tried once again to get them to stick to the original deal. We were just passing under the stairs of the Europe Center, and after a pause I noticed that it had gotten very quiet behind us. I turned around and Stella was gone. It was as if she'd been swallowed up by the earth. And the dope had gone with her. The 3 customers noticed this as well, and they looked pissed. This was typical Stella. I was fuming. Suspecting that she had to have disappeared into the Europe Center, I sprinted up the stairs of the pedestrian bridge toward the center with Dittelf right behind me. The 2 Tinas didn't get away though the foreigners had grabbed them. When we got inside the complex, I went to the left and Dittelf went to the right, running like lunatics. Not a trace of Stella. And now Dittelf was gone, too, and on top of that, I felt guilty because of the Tinas. In the distance I could see them being dragged into a hotel by the Turks, and I had to wait for hours outside, all alone, until they finally came back. At that point, they at the very least deserved to get their share of the dope. I had an idea where to find Stella. The Tinas and I took the subway to the Kurfürstendamm station. There wasn't much happening there because around this time of day the action moved to the club down the street. But we knew where to look and made a beeline for the station's bathrooms. As soon as we were through the door, I heard her. She was yapping at someone. This bathroom had a lot of stalls, but it was easy to find her. I banged against the stall door with my fists and yelled, "Stella, open this door right now, or else." The door flew open immediately and out she came. Little Tina slapped her across the face. But Stella, flying high, just said, here's your dope. I don't want any of it." And with that, she was gone. That was bullshit, of course. Stella had shot up a good $250 right away, just so that we couldn't get at it. But the 2 Tinas and I threw the remaining quarter in with the dope that we'd just bought and divided it all fairly amongst ourselves. For me, it was more than enough. In fact, I had trouble getting up again from the toilet. We went to Treebor's, the club down the street. There was Stella, doing her thing. She was negotiating with a dealer. We got right in her face and told her to give us the half-gram that she had taken. She coughed it up without a fuss. So she did feel a little guilty after all. But I still let her know my mind. "You're a piece of shit, Stella. I never want to see you or have anything to do with you ever again." In the club, I shot up my share of Stella's dope and got myself a Coke. I sat alone in a corner. It was the first time since the beginning of this afternoon that I'd had some quiet time. For a moment, I was hoping that Dittelf would turn up again. But at that point, it was too late. I'd started to do some thinking. It all started harmlessly enough. I thought to myself, this is all so fucked. First your boyfriend ditches you, and then your best girlfriend rips you off. Friendships just can't exist among addicts. You're completely alone. You're always alone. Everything else is in your imagination. That whole terror this afternoon over just one shot. And what good did that shot do you? It wasn't anything special. Every day there's some new kind of terror. And for what? It was a moment of real lucidity. I did have lucid moments sometimes, but only when I was on H9 I was sober. I was completely unreliable and irresponsible, as this day, among others, proved so clearly. I sat there and continued to reflect on my existence. It wasn't at all dramatic. I was very calm about it. In fact, I couldn't have gotten animated even if I wanted to, with all that heroin in my system. I decided that there was no way I would be going back to the hospital. I mean, it was already after 11 o'clock. I would be been kicked out anyway, and no other hospital would have taken me in. The doctor had told my mom that my liver was about to go into cirrhosis. 46 If I kept on going like this, he estimated that I had 2 years left to live, at most. As for the drug counseling center at the university, they were done with me. There was no point in even trying to call them since they would have heard all the news about me from the hospital. They were right not to take in someone like me. After all, there were plenty of addicts in Berlin who sincerely wanted therapy, and not everyone could get a spot. It made sense that they would only work with the people who wanted to help themselves out of their condition and who had enough willpower to really do it. I obviously was not such a person. I had probably started shooting up a bit too early to ever get clean again. I was thinking very clearly. I looked soberly at the facts of my life and sipped on my Coke. Where should I go tonight? My mom would, and he slammed the door in my face. Or she would have called the police the next morning to pick me up and put me into a home. That's what I would have done if I was in her shoes. My dad was in Thailand. Stella and I were over. And Dittelf, I didn't even know where he was sleeping that night, or with whom. If he was serious about getting clean, then he'd be at his dad's. And if that was the case, then he'd be gone again soon anyway. So I didn't even have a bed. Not for that night, and not for the next night either. The last time I'd done some sober thinking, I'd come to the conclusion that I had two options. I had to either quit H for good and all, or I had to give myself the golden shot. The first option seemed like it was out. 5 or 6 relapses were all the evidence I needed anyway. I was no better and no worse than any of the other addicts. Why should I of all people belong to the lucky subset of people who were able to get away from heroin? I was nobody special. I went on to the Kudamm and took the subway to the Kurfürstenstrasse. I'd never done any whoring on the Kurfürstenstrasse at night. Girls avoided it at night because that's when the pros took over. I wasn't afraid though. I quickly did 2 customers and took the subway back to Treebours. With 100 marks in my hand, I bought myself half a gram. I didn't want to use the bathroom in Treebours for my shot or the one at Kurfürstendamm. There was too much activity over there at night. I got myself another Coke and thought about where I could go. The toilets at the Bundesplatz came to mind. There wasn't a soul there at night. Even in the mornings it was usually pretty quiet. So I made my way over there. I wasn't panicking. I was totally calm. There's something really creepy about empty public bathrooms at night. But somehow I felt sheltered and safe when I got there. It was clean and bright. I had the whole place to myself. The bathrooms at the Bundesplatz are the best ones in Berlin. The toilet stalls are huge. There was one time when we crammed 6 of us into one stall. There's no space between the bottom of the doors and the floor, and there are no holes drilled into any of the walls. Because it was so nice and private, quite a few addicts had already killed themselves over here. No old ladies, no peeping toms, and no cops. So there wasn't any rush. I took my time. I washed my face and brushed my hair before I cleaned the syringe that I'd borrowed from Tina. I was sure that half a gram would be enough. After the last few withdrawals of mine, 1/4 of a gram had been sufficient to knock me out. And I already had more than 1/4 in my system. My BCO was also pretty worn down from the jaundice. I would and rather had a whole gram though. Ats had done it with a full gram. But I couldn't face doing another 2 customers. So with peace in my heart, I picked out the cleanest stall. I felt really calm. I wasn't scared. I'd never thought that committing suicide would be so prosaic. I didn't think about my past life. I didn't think about my mom. I didn't think about Dittelf. I only thought about the shot. I spread my stuff out around me in the stall like I always did. I put the dope on the spoon, another thing I'd borrowed from Tina, and suddenly realized that I, too, had ripped off Tina. She was sitting at Treebor's right now, waiting for me to come back with her syringe and spoon. But there was nothing I could do about it now. I'd forgotten to bring some lemon, but the dope was good and dissolved without it. I looked for a vein in my left arm. It was just like with every other shot I'd ever done, with the sole difference being that this was supposed to be my last one. On the second try, I hit the vein. I could see blood. Then I banged the whole half-gram into my arm. I didn't get a chance to pull back the plunger and shoot in the remainder. What I felt was how it first tore through my heart and then absolutely exploded through the roof of my brain. When I woke up, it was light outside. The cars were making a huge amount of noise. I was lying next to the toilet. I pulled the plunger and the needle out of my arm. When I wanted to stand up, I realized that my right leg was somehow paralyzed. I could move it a little, but it made the joints hum like hell. Especially my hip joint. Somehow I managed to open the stall door. I crawled at first, but then I pulled myself up. I could hop along the wall on my one good leg. When I came out of the bathrooms, there were two boys out in front, both about 15 or so. Satin jackets and skin-tight jeans. Two young gay boys. I was glad that they were gay. They literally caught me as I came hopping out of the bathrooms, looking like a ghost. They immediately figured it out and one of them said, "Geez, what the hell were you thinking?" I didn't know them, but they'd seen me at Zoo Station a couple of times. The boys brought me over to a bench. It was a freezing cold October morning. One of them gave me a Marlboro. I thought, funny that these gay hipster types are always smoking Marlboros or Camels. Must be because of all the attractive guys in the ads. Somewhere inside me, I was kind of glad that it hadn't worked with the half-gram. I told the boys the story of how Stella had ripped me off and explained that afterward I'd shot up a full half-gram. They were very sweet and asked if they could take me anywhere. The question bugged me because I didn't want to have to think. I said that they should just let me sit on the bench. But I was shivering with cold, and they thought I should go see a doctor since I couldn't even walk. I didn't want to go to any doctor. They said that they knew a really cool doctor, a gay guy, who could help me out. It reassured me that the guy was gay because in a situation like this I trusted them more. The boys hailed a cab and took me over to see this guy. It was just like they said, he was really cool. He let me lie down on his bed and examined me. He wanted to talk to me about heroin abuse and other stuff like that, but I didn't feel like talking to anyone. I asked him for some sleeping pills. He gave me one sleeping pill and some other medication as well. Almost immediately afterward, my nose started to bleed again, and I started to run a fever. I slept for the next 2 days. When my brain started working again on the third day, I couldn't stand it anymore. I didn't want to think. I had to really pull myself together and work at it just to keep from going crazy. I was obsessed with just two thoughts: 1, God wasn't ready for me to quit yet. And 2, the next time you try something like that, be sure to take a full gram. I wanted to get outside, out onto the heroin scene. I wanted to shoot up, wander around from person to person and group to group, and not think about anything again, until it was time to end things for real. I still couldn't walk normally. The doctor was really worried about me. When he realized that he couldn't hold me back anymore, he got me some crutches. I hobbled off on the crutches and then threw them into the bushes somewhere along the way when I got close. I didn't want people to see me with crutches. If I pulled myself together, I could still move around. I struggled over to Zoo Station and made arrangements with a few Johns pretty quickly. One of the sessions was with a foreigner, but I didn't care anymore about the taboo of not doing foreigners. I didn't care what Stella and Babsy would have thought. I didn't care about anything. Maybe I was still hoping against hope that my mom would come looking for me. If she'd been looking for me, she would have come here. That's why I probably didn't go to Kurfürstenstrasse. But I knew in my heart of hearts that no one was looking for me anymore. And for a moment, I remembered how wonderful it was when my mom was still concerned about me. I bought dope, shot up, and went back to the station. I needed money in case I couldn't find a customer who would invite me to spend the night with at the station. I met Rolf, Dittlef's regular from before. In those days, I spent lots of weekend nights at his place. As it turned out, Dittlef had been staying with Rolf again over the last few weeks, but Rolf wasn't a customer anymore. He'd been shooting dope for a while now, too, and was at the station looking for customers. He didn't have an easy time finding John since he was already 26. When I asked Rolf about Dittlef, Rolf started crying. Dittlef was in a therapy program, and now that he was gone, Rolf was absolutely distraught. He felt like life was meaningless, he wanted to withdraw, too, and he kept talking about how much he loved Dittlef. He wanted to kill himself. All in all, it was the usual junkie soap opera. All this talk about Dittlef kind of pissed me off. I didn't get why this rundown, sorry excuse for a man thought he had any claim to Dittlef. He actually, in all seriousness, wanted Dittlef to quit and come back to join him. He'd even given Dittlef a key to his apartment. N7 hen I heard that, I lost it. God, you're such a dick, I told him. Giving Dittlef a key to your place and encouraging him to abandon his plan to get clean. That's so selfish. If you really cared about him, then you'd do everything you could to support him right now. You're unbelievable. Rolf was already in withdrawal, so it was easy for me to humiliate him. But then I realized that I could probably stay at his place if I played my cards right, so I forced myself to be more pleasant. I told him that if he'd let me crash at his place, I'd go off with a John myself and buy some dope. Rolf could not have been happier as it turned out, and I guess that sort of makes sense since Dittlef and I were the only people that he knew in Berlin. That's how I came to share his big French bed with him. We actually got along great when Dittlef wasn't there. He grossed me out, but in the end he was just kind of a sad, pathetic character. So there we were, Dittlef's two lovers, lying together in a big French bed. It was the same thing every night. Rolf would start blabbering about how much he loved Dittlef, and then he would cry his eyes out before he went to sleep. That whole act got on my nerves, but I didn't say anything. I needed that spot in Rolf's bed. I didn't even say anything when he bragged about how he wanted to furnish a nice apartment for Dittlef once they were both clean and sober. I didn't give a shit, but I guess I was paying the price, in a way, for my previous crimes because what had happened to Rolf was really our fault. If he hadn't met us, he would have stayed a poor, lonely crane operator, who occasionally drowned his sorrows in alcohol. Things went on like this for a week. Whoring, shooting up, whoring, shooting up, and at night, Rolf's lovesick chatter. Then one morning I woke up earlier than usual, just as someone was unlocking the front door and banging stuff around in the hall. I thought it was Rolf, so I yelled at him to shut up and let me sleep. But then I saw Dittlef. We grabbed a hold of each other and didn't let go, until it suddenly dawned on me why he was here. Oh no, I said. Did they kick you out? He nodded and then explained why. Like all the other people who had been newly admitted, Dittlef had been given 3 weeks of early morning wake-up duty as his first chore. It's almost impossible for any heroin addict to show up anywhere on time. To wake up every morning at the same time and immediately jump into action is just about the most difficult thing for an addict to do. That's exactly why they demanded this of the new arrivals, to make sure that the few available spots were given to those who really had the strength and willpower to make it. Dittlef, in any case, couldn't do it. He overslept 3 times and was sent packing. Dittlef told me that he'd actually liked it in the program. It was tough, but he would be able to make it the next time. Now his goal was to stay clean as best as he could, and then try once again for a spot in a therapy program. He said there'd been a few people there that we knew pretty well, like Frank, for example. Frank was there because his friend Ingo had recently died. He'd been 14, just like Babsy. I asked Ditlev what he wanted to do, and he said, first thing, score some dope. I asked him to bring me back some. 2 hours later, Ditlev returned. He'd brought a former customer with him, a guy named Pico. Pico reached into his pocket, pulled out a plastic bag, and set it on the table. I thought I was seeing things. It was full of dope. 10 grams. Never in my whole life had I seen that much heroin. After I was done gaping at it in disbelief, I asked Ditlev, did you lose your mind? 10 grams, here in the apartment. He said, definitely not. I'm a dealer now. I asked, did you think about the cops? If they catch you, you'll go straight back to jail. You'd wind up doing serious time. It could a few years. Ditlev said, I don't have time to worry about cops right now. First I need to make sure that I can make a living. So just let it go. Stop badgering. He started to measure off small quantities with his pocket knife and gathered little piles of the stuff on bits of foil paper. I could see that the pieces of foil were way too small. I said, listen to me. People are just begging to be ripped off. You have to take larger pieces of foil, put the same amount of dope in it, and then roll it out so it looks bigger. People trust what they see, and they don't look too carefully either. Think of the candy at movie theaters. Gigantic boxes, but they're always never more than 2/3 full. Will you please get off my back, he whined. I'm putting extra dope into each packet. People will notice it. And then word will get around that I am the man they need to see. Whose dope is this, anyway? I finally asked. It belonged to Pico, of course, that slimy little crook. He used to survive on office burglaries. He'd recently gotten out of jail, on probation, and now he wanted to make a quick buck off of Ditlev. Ditlev, who was always sweet for his own good. Pico had gotten the dope from some pimps on Potsdamer Street. They were his friends from jail. He got the stuff at dealer rates, but he didn't want to have to deal himself. Instead, he wanted Ditlev to take care of it. Pico didn't know the first thing about the heroin scene. He was a drinker. Ivan Ditlev was finished up with his packets. We counted and added up the quarters, halves, and full grams for him. Math was never my strong suit, but I realized before Ditlev did that we only had 8 grams to sell, all told. He'd put too much in each of the packets, and if he'd sold them like this, he would have had to pay for 2 grams out of his own pocket. So we had to go back and redistribute the dope. I made sure to pocket any scraps that stuck to the papers for my own use later on. Ditlev made bigger foil packets and rolled out the dope with a beer bottle to make it look like a bigger supply. He only packaged halves and actually ended up with 25 packets. Not bad. We shot up 2 packets to test the supply. It was good shit. That same night, we took to the entire supply to Treebors, but for the moment, we decided to stash most of it. We buried it next to the dumpsters in the back. We never had more than 3 packets on us at any time. If there'd been a raid, they couldn't have nailed us as dealers. And in the end, it went pretty well. We sold 5 grams that first night. Word got around that the dope was good and that our portions were decent. Stella was the only one who complained about us. But in the end, even she got on board and asked if she could broker some deals for us. Like an idiot, I let her. For 5 halves that she sold for us, she got a quarter. But for us, there was nothing left. We didn't get one single penny from Pico for our dealing. If we sold 10 grams, we could keep 1.5. And out of that, we still had to pay our own agents. That meant our earnings from dealing only amounted to our own daily requirement of Pico came by every morning to collect his take. On most nights, we managed to bring in about 2,000 marks. That was 1,000 marks net profit for Pico because the profit margin from the middleman to the dealer is 100%. What we got was our 1.5 grams. In the meantime, Pico also didn't have to run hardly any of the risk, unless we ratted him out. But that had already occurred to Pico, so he'd planned ahead. He threatened that if we ever got arrested and even so much as breathed one word to the police, we might as well go ahead and pick out a coffin that we liked. His buddies from Potsdamer Street would take care of us. And he said that he wouldn't even have to wait until we were out of jail. He had friends everywhere. He also threatened to set his pimps on us if we tried to cheat him of any of his money. We believed every word he said. The pimps had me legitimately terrified. I knew all about what they'd done to Babsy. But Ditlev refused to acknowledge that Pico was ripping us off. He said, "What do you want? The main thing is that you don't have to work as a prostitute anymore. I don't want you to do that ever again. And I don't want to do it either. And what other options do we have?" Most of the small street dealers didn't fare any better than we did. They could never even get enough cash together to buy 10 grams and start their own careers as middlemen. Besides, they didn't have the connections. How could we have gotten access to the pimps and other big-time dealers on Potsdamer Street? The small street dealers, who were all addicts themselves, needed a middleman who could pay them in dope. And the small-timers were always the ones who wound up in jail. Guys like Pico hardly ever got tangled up with the cops. They had an almost endless supply of street dealers to do their dirty work. Almost any junkie was willing to risk some prison time for 2 shots a day. After a couple of days spent dealing at Treebours, things were already getting too hot for us. There were always undercover cops lurking around. I was having a hard time dealing with the stress. So we reorganized the whole thing. I kept negotiating at Treebours, and Ditlev hung around Stiglitz station. Then, when I found a buyer, I'd send him over to Ditlev at Stiglitz station. The next week, when Ditlev was back at Treebours and had some dope on him, a guy pulled over next to him and asked how to get to Zoo station. Ditlev freaked out and just started running. He threw the dope into the bushes somewhere. When we met up again later that night, Ditlev said he was sure the guy was a cop because nobody in Berlin would have to ask where Zoo station it was bad. It was like everywhere we turned, we saw a cop, in every car and around every corner at the Kudamm. We didn't even dare look for the dope that Ditlev had thrown away. We thought that the cops would be waiting for us. We went into the Athena Grill to discuss our next move. We couldn't settle up with Pico the next morning because the dope was gone. And he would never believe our story. Then I got the idea to tell him that we'd been ripped off by some foreigners. We would say that a bunch of them had mugged us and taken all the dope and all our money. I said, weird shit's gonna happen with Pico anyway. So we should just spend the rest of the money. It's crazy that we haven't made a single cent while Pico is able to pull in 1,000 marks every day. At the very least, I need to buy myself some clothes. I don't have anything for the winter right now. I can't run around all winter in the same clothes that I wore when I escaped from the hospital. We weren't born to be dealers. And although Ditlev wasn't ready to admit that yet, he did finally agree that it didn't matter whether we gave Pico 200 marks or nothing at all. Very early the next morning we went to the flea market. If I liked something, Ditlev would try it on first, and then me. We only wanted to buy what we could both wear, so that we could swap clothes occasionally. I ended up buying a used fur coat that looked really cute on Ditlev. Then we bought some perfume, a music box, and other junk. But we just couldn't manage to spend all the cash because we couldn't bring ourselves to buy stuff that was expensive and useless. So we just stashed the rest of the money. As soon as we walked through the door of Rolf's apartment, Pico showed up. Ditlev said that he hadn't had his fix yet and needed to shoot up before cashing out. That wasn't true, of course, since as usual we'd had our fix as soon as we gotten up. But Ditlev just wasn't ready to deal with this shit with Pico. Pico said, okay, and sat down to read a thriller that I had on me. Ditlev rammed another quarter into his veins and then passed out without even pulling out the spike first. It wasn't surprising that he'd passed out like that because he already had another quarter in his system. I pulled the syringe out of his arm for him because if you just left it in then the blood would clot in the needle, and it would be hard to flush it out again. And this was our last syringe and needle, so that was pretty thoughtless of him, I thought. As I was dabbing the puncture in his arm with a cotton ball, I noticed that he wasn't really resisting me at all. I lifted his arm, and when I let go it just flopped back down, completely limp. I shook him and tried to wake him up, but he just slid out of the armchair. His face was ashen and his lips were blue. I tore open his shirt and tried to find a heartbeat. I couldn't. I ran out of the apartment and into the hallway, still in just my underwear, but Pico was right behind me. Don't do anything stupid, he yelled. I rang the doorbell of a neighbor who had a phone, and told her I had to call the police immediately. I called 911 and said, my boyfriend's not breathing. He's overdosing. I had just given the cop the address when Pico came running back and yelled, stop, stop, he's conscious again. So I told the cop, sorry, never mind. It was a false alarm. You don't need to come after all. Then I hung up. Ditlev lay on his back with his eyes wide open. Pico asked if I'd said something about drugs on the phone, and if I'd given them the address. I said, no, not directly. I don't think they could really take everything in that fast. Pico called me a hysterical bitch. He was frantic, slapping Ditlev in the face and forcing him to stand up immediately. I told him he should leave Ditlev alone for a while. Then he screamed, shut up and get me some water, you stupid fucking cow. When I came back, Ditlev was upright and Pico was berating him. I was so relieved to see Ditlev conscious again that all I wanted to do was go and hug him, but Ditlev literally shoved me away. Pico splashed some water in his face and said, come on, boy, we've got to go. Ditlev still looked pale as a ghost, and he could barely stay upright. I told him he should lie down again. Shut up. Pico screamed at me. Ditlev agreed that he didn't have time. And then they left the apartment together, with Pico acting as Ditlev's support. I was having a hard time coming to grips with what had happened. I was shaking like crazy. After all, for a second I was convinced that Ditlev had died. I lay down on the bed and tried to concentrate on my thriller. Then the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole. It was the cops. I don't know what I was thinking, but instead of hightailing it out the window, I just went and opened the door. I admitted that yes, it was me who had called. I told them that the apartment belonged to a gay guy who was on vacation. And this morning 2 young guys came by and injected something into their arms. One of them had keeled over afterward and that's when I'd called the police. The cops wanted me to give them names and descriptions, and I managed to come up with something for them. They took down my personal information and called it in. It didn't take long for a reply to come back. One of the cops said, well, why don't you come along then? You've been reported as missing. The cops were pretty nice though. They waited for me to put 2 of my books into a bag, and then they gave me time to write a note to Ditlev. Dear Ditlev, I wrote, you can probably guess that I've been picked up. More news soon. Lots of love, Christiane. I taped the note to the front door with some scotch tape. First they took me to the Friedrichstrasse police station and then to a holding cell. It was like something straight out of an American Western. Seriously, it even had iron bars instead of walls. When they locked me up, the iron door clanged into the lock with the same sound that I recognized from movies about Dodge City and Deadwood. And when they turned the key, it even made that famous creaky, grinding noise. There I stood, hands wrapped around the bars, utterly defeated. I couldn't even bear to take stock of how depressing it all was, so instead I just lay down on the cot and fell asleep. At that point I was also still pretty doped up. Later on, they brought me a little plastic container for my urine sample and a backup bucket to put below, so that I wouldn't pee on the floor. Anyone walking by would have been able to watch me pee. I got nothing to eat or drink for the entire day. My mom came by around nightfall. She walked right past my cell without really looking at me. I guess she had to clear something up with the cops first. When they did finally unlock the door for her to get me, my mom just said, "Good evening," as if I was a stranger. Then she grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me away with her. Klaus was outside, waiting for us in the car. My mom shoved me into the middle seat and sat down beside me. Nobody said anything. Klaus got lost on the way back, and we wound up driving all over Berlin. It seemed like we would never get home. When we stopped at a gas station, I told my mom that I was hungry and asked her if she could buy me 3 Bounty chocolate bars. 47 She said okay, and got out to buy them. After the second Bounty, I got sick. Klaus had to stop the car so that I could throw up. We started heading northbound on the Autobahn, and that's when I realized that we weren't going home at all. Maybe it was going to be another institution or maybe a home, but either way I would break out soon enough. But then I started paying attention to the highway signs, and I realized where they were taking me, the airport. That's just fucking perfect, I thought. Now they want to ship me out of Berlin entirely. As soon as we got out at the airport, my mom grabbed hold of me again, tightly. Then I spoke for just the second time since our reunion. Very slowly, emphasizing each and every word, I said, "Would you please let go of me?" But she held tight and stayed close by my side. Klaus was trailing behind us, ready to chase me down if need be. At that point, I just kind of resigned myself to whatever they were going to do. In the end, it didn't matter what they tried. There was nothing anyone could do for me. That's how I felt at the time anyway. I did survey my options for escape when I saw the signs for Hamburg, but in the end I was too weak-willed to really do anything. Hamburg. Jesus. I had a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, and a cousin who all lived in a small town about 30 miles outside of Hamburg. They were all incredibly dull, sad little people. Very bourgeois. Their house was so neat and tidy, it made me want to bath. You couldn't find a speck of dust, even if you tried. I once walked around that house in bare feet for an entire afternoon, and at night my feet were still so clean that I didn't have to wash them. On the plane, I pretended to read my book. I got through a few pages. My mom was still playing deaf and dumb. She hadn't even told me where we were going yet. As the flight attendant rattled off her little speech and got to the part where she said she hoped we'd had a pleasant flight, I noticed that my mom was crying. Then the words poured out of her. Without hardly stopping to take a breath, she told me how she just wanted to do what was best for me. She'd had a dream recently, where I was lying dead in a bathroom stall with blood all over the place and my legs all twisted up. A dealer had killed me, and she had to come identify me. I'd always believed that my mom had psychic powers. Whenever she had a bad feeling about how the day was going to go, she would tell me to stay home, and when I didn't, then presto, LD get tangled up in a raid or get ripped off, or some other disaster would happen. It made me think of Pico, about how, when everything fell apart, Ditlev and I had just ripped him off. Maybe my mom was saving my life with this intervention of hers. I didn't think any further than that. I didn't want to. Since my failed suicide attempt, I didn't want to think about much of anything. After we landed in Hamburg, I went with my mom and my aunt to the airport restaurant. My mom had to take the next flight back. I ordered an orange soda, Florida Boy, my favorite brand, but they didn't have it. I guess they thought they were too good for orange soda here. So I didn't drink anything, although I was dying of thirst. Together, my mom and my aunt started in on me. In a half hour, they laid out my whole future. I would have to go back to school, I would have to behave well and find new friends, and then later on I could do some kind of an apprenticeship. And then, once I was done training for a career, I could return to Berlin. For them, it was simple. My mom was bawling again when we said goodbye. And I had to fight to keep from crying myself. That was on the 13th of November, 1977. Christiane's mom. That whole day, I had to make an incredible effort to control myself and pull myself together. On the return flight to Berlin, I broke down and cried until all of the accumulated stress and anxiety had drained out of my system. I was sad and relieved at the same time. Sad because I had to give Christiane away. Relieved because I'd finally gotten her away from heroin. I was convinced that I'd finally done the right thing. After the failure of the Narconon therapy, I realized that Christiane's only chance for survival depended on me taking her to a place where there simply was no heroin. Vivan Christiane was living with her dad, and I had some distance from the whole thing, and some peace and quiet. It became clear as day to me that she'd die if she stayed in Berlin. Although my ex-husband assured me that Christiane had been off heroin since she'd been with him, I didn't put any stock in that. I would have never thought that my fear for Christiane's life could get even worse. But after the death of her friend Babsi, I didn't have even one single minute of peace. When Babsi died, I wanted to take Christiane to stay with her relatives in Western Germany immediately. But her dad refused to agree to that. Since Christiane had moved in with him, he had obtained a court order for temporary custody. Anything I said was useless. He just didn't understand. Maybe because he hadn't yet experienced what I'd experienced. Maybe because he couldn't admit defeat. While Christiane was living with her dad, I received the indictment against her. She was supposed to stand trial on account of her offenses against the narcotics law. Mrs. Chipk from the narcotics department had already called to give me a heads up. To comfort me, she said that I shouldn't blame myself for what Christiane was doing. Anyone who wants to do drugs will do drugs, she said. It's ultimately up to them. She knew lots of addicts who came from good, upstanding families. And they also had to appear in court to deal with charges like these. I shouldn't torture myself about it. I thought it was really cynical of them to use a little packet of heroin that I had once found in Christiane's room as evidence against her. Mrs. Chipk had innocently asked me to send her that packet for inspection. She had told me not to put my return address on the letter because that way nothing could be proven. I don't think it's right that young people like Christiane are condemned for their drug use. Christiane never hurt anyone. She only destroyed herself. Who should sit as judge on that? And everyone knows how useless prisons are in curing addiction. The indictment was one more reason for me to send Christiane to West Germany. 48-1 was determined to get her to safety. I went to the guardianship office and explained the whole situation to them, everything, down to the last detail. For the first time, I felt like someone in some government agency or department was actually listening to me. Mr. Tillman, the social worker responsible for our case, also thought that Christiane would be better off in Western Germany. He wanted to try to secure a spot for her in a rehab program since it was impossible to predict how soon he could restore custody of Christiane to me. In the meantime, It would be easier to get my ex-husband to agree to enroll Christiane in a rehab program than it would be to get him to agree simply to send her to her relatives in Western Germany. I could sense that Mr. Tillman was really engaged and interested in helping Christiane and wasn't just making empty promises. One afternoon shortly after my discussion with Tillman, Christiane suddenly appeared on my doorstep. She'd just returned from the drug advice center again. She was a complete wreck, pumped full of heroin and talking about suicide and giving herself the golden shot. I calmed her down first, then put her to bed. Then I immediately called up Mr. Tillman. He came by right away. When Christiane awoke, the three of us drew up a solid plan. First, Christiane should do her physical withdrawal in the state's psychiatric hospital. After that, she should get a spot in a therapeutic community home called Bonnie's Ranch. Both the drug counseling center and Mr. Tillman were in contact with this therapy program on behalf of Christiane. Christiane was very willing and allowed all of this to be done for her. Mr. Tillman immediately jumped on making the most urgent necessary arrangements. We got an appointment with the child psychiatrist and the key F doctor at Bonnie's Ranch, who issued the admission papers for Christiane. After that, Mr. Tillman drove to Christiane's dad's with the admission papers and put the pressure on him until he agreed to let me take Christiane to the hospital. 2 weeks after Christiane was admitted to Bonnie's Ranch, she was transferred to the Rudolf Virchow Hospital for an operation to treat her infection. I assumed, of course, that a child who was a heroin addict being transferred from Bonnie's Ranch to Rudolf Virchow Hospital for an operation would be closely supervised and continue to receive appropriate care. But all they did was unload Christiane at the hospital. Whatever happened after that wasn't their concern. Christiane walked right out of the hospital and made her way back to the streets. I was incredibly bitter about the sloppy coordination between the therapy program and the hospital, which threatened to undo everything we'd accomplished up to that point. After that experience, I lost all faith in institutions. I told myself that it was up to me to help my child. Mr. Tillman tried to give me renewed courage. He was the only one I felt like I could trust. Luckily, Christiane didn't stay away for long. She came back the next evening to cry her eyes out on my shoulder. She had shot up again, but I didn't get mad at her. I'd lost all aggressive feelings toward her. How many times in the past had I vented all my rage on Christiane out of sheer frustration over not being able to help her? Now that she had come back to me, I just took her into my arms and we had a calm, quiet talk with each other. Christiane was determined to keep following the plan that we'd set up together with Mr. Tillman. And I said, "Good, that's what we'll do." But I also made it absolutely clear to her that if she messed up one more time, she'd have to leave Berlin and go to Western Germany. She really took this to heart and gave me her word that she would stay clean. During those next few days, she regularly went to the drug counseling center. She really hung on to the hope of a future spot in a drug therapy program. Sometimes she waited for hours for her turn with a drug advisor. At home she sat down and wrote out her resume because that was one of the admission requirements. Everything was looking good. Her spot in the drug therapy program seemed as good as certain. The community home that would take her in was all set. We were planning how to celebrate Christmas when she was in the community home, since it was already the beginning of November. Her dad had, in the meantime, admitted to the fruitlessness of his attempts to help Christiane and agreed to the plan we had decided on. Finally, there seemed to be light at the end of the tunnel. But then Christiane came down with her second case of jaundice, which threw a wrench in the works. Her temperature climbed to almost 1050 F overnight. The next morning, I took her to Stiglitz Hospital. Christiane was completely yellow. She couldn't stand up and had to crawl to get down the hallway. After the exam, the doctor said that Christiane was suffering from congestion of the liver due to her drug abuse. Unfortunately, they couldn't keep her there because they didn't have an isolation ward at Stiglitz Hospital. I later found out that this wasn't true. Stiglitz Hospital had an isolation ward with 20/5 beds. The truth was that they just didn't want to take in a heroin addict. The doctor there still made an intake appointment for us at the Rudolf Virchow Hospital for the next morning. Within a couple of days, Christiane's yellow coloring began to disappear. Soon she was feeling much better and was looking forward to the therapy program. Her counselor from the Drug Advice Center even came by to visit. I was as hopeful for her recovery as I'd been in a long time. Then I let my guard down and made the unforgivable mistake of allowing Ditlev to visit Christiane in the hospital. Christiane had really wanted to see him. Ditlev had been released from jail, where he'd gotten clean, and he was out on parole. He'd also managed to secure a spot in a drug therapy program for himself. I didn't want to deny them a reunion. After all, I knew they loved each other. And I thought that maybe it would strengthen their resolve, and they would mutually encourage each other, knowing that the other was also going into rehab. How could I have been so impossibly naive? Soon after Ditlev's visit, Christiane slipped out for an afternoon. When I stopped by to visit her after work, she had just returned, and I could tell that she'd gotten high while she was away. That alone wouldn't have knocked me over. Not anymore. But when she tried to tell me that she'd just gone to the Gedachtniskirche for 9 to eat spaghetti when she lied to me, that almost made my knees buckle. I asked the nurse on duty if I could stay with Christiane to keep her out of trouble. I would pay for the bed, of course. She said that that wasn't possible. She would keep an eye on Christiane in the future. 3 days later, when I came by after work again, the nurse walked up to me and said, "Your daughter's gone." "Well, could you tell me where she is?" I asked. "We don't know. She got permission to go for a walk in the park and then she didn't return." I can't even describe how I felt. At home I lay down in the living room right next to the phone. At 11:20 p.m. at night, the hospital called to say that Christiane had returned. The indifference of the nurse was disturbing. Their attitude was, if she escapes, then she escapes. That's her business. We've had enough addicts here to know that they all bolt eventually. The doctor seemed pretty cold about it, too. All she did was explain to me that she didn't have any influence over Christiane's behavior. If Christiane violated hospital regulations one more time, she'd have to be released due to lack of self-discipline. The results of the liver tests showed that if she continued on her current trajectory, she'd only reach the age of 20, at most. The doctor promised to have a serious talk with Christiane. Unfortunately, that was all she could say and do in Christiane's case. The next evening, the hospital called to say that Christiane was gone again. Once again, I spent the whole night on the sofa next to the phone. This time, Christiane didn't come back at all. She was gone for 2 weeks. I didn't know if she was alive or dead. The first 2 or 3 days, my boyfriend and I continued to go out looking for her. We did the usual search through the clubs and subway stations. Then I was asked to pick up her things from the hospital. When I brought her bag home and unpacked her books and toiletries and personal items that I'd brought her while she was in the hospital, I finally sank down to the point where I told myself, "There, now you just have to let her fall flat on her face." I told myself, okay, if this is what she wants, then she's got to deal with it herself. I stopped looking for her. I was too hurt for words. I wanted her to feel that my patience with her was over and that I would really stick to my guns this time. How long I could have kept that up is anyone's guess. I reported her as missing at the next police station and left a photo of her for the cops. I was sure they'd pick her up during one of their next drug raids. And then I'd get on the next plane with her and take her to Western Germany. After 14 days, on a Monday morning, I got the call from the police station. The officer at the other end of the line was unusually nice, considering how loudly Christiane was shouting and screaming at them in the station. I asked the officer to hold her there. I said I'd pick her up in the early afternoon. Next, I ordered the tickets, a round-trip ticket for me and a one-way ticket for Christiane. As I ordered her one-way ticket, I felt a stab of sadness and pain. But I pushed through it and called my relatives with our flight information. By that afternoon, everything was taken care of. On the way to the police station, I stopped to pick up my boyfriend. I thought, if she sits between the two of us, she can't jump out of the car. Christiane didn't say a word when I picked her up from the station. I didn't either. I just couldn't. At the airport, my knees were shaking, and my heart was in my throat. Christiane still didn't say anything. She completely ignored me. Right up until departure time, she sat in her seat, chewing her fingernails and reading a novel that she'd brought with her. But at least she hadn't made any attempts to run away. Only when we were on the plane did I breathe a sigh of relief. During takeoff, she looked out the window. It was dark already. I said to her, "Well, now that's over. This chapter of our lives has come to an end. You're going to stay with Aunt Evelyn. I hope that you'll finally be able to start a new life out there." One spent the first 4 days at my aunt and grandma's just going absolutely cold turkey. Then, once that was over and I was able to stand up again, I put back on my old uniform. It was the outfit of a junkie bride, from the rabbit fur coat to the high-heeled boots. I definitely managed to stand out from the pack. I put on my makeup and took my aunt's dog for a walk in the woods every morning, and every morning I'd get dressed up as if I was about to hit Berlin's heroin scene. My high heels got stuck in the sand, and I tripped a lot and got my knees covered in bruises. But when my grandma suggested that she could take me shopping to buy me some more sensible walking shoes, I could feel my entire body constricting. Just those 2 words alone, walking shoes, made me shudder in horror. It turned out that my aunt, who had just turned 30, was pretty fun to talk to, not about any of the real problems that I had, but I didn't want to talk about that stuff anyway. My real problems all boiled down to one thing, of course, H-dope and everything that was connected to dope. Diddlef, the scene, coup d'âme, the piece of a good shot, calmness, freedom. I tried not to think too much, even now that I was clean. When I did think, it was mainly about how I'd eventually be able to clear out of this place. But, unlike before, I never really made a plan to escape. I kept putting it off, pushing it away. I just thought, someday you'll run away. I was probably afraid to leave because freedom, over the last 2 years, had turned out to be a pretty terrifying thing. My aunt's rules were oppressive. At 15 years of age, I had to be back in the house exactly at 9:30 p.m. on the nights that I was allowed out at all. I hadn't had a curfew like that since I was 12. Her rules really got on my nerves. But it was funny how I followed them. During the holidays, we went to Hamburg to do our Christmas shopping. We got up early and tried to get to the department stores before they got too crowded, but that didn't work. It was a nightmare. Hours and hours of squeezing our way through these desperate packs of wild-eyed shoppers. Everywhere we went, they were snatching at boxes and packages, and digging around in their fat purses. My grandma and my aunt and my uncle and my cousin kept trying on clothes and taking them off again. But it seemed like they could never find the exact right gift for Aunt Hedwig or Aunt Ida, for Joshen and for whoever else they had on their list. And my uncle still needed to find a pair of insoles for his shoes and something else for the car, which he thought he could get for cheaper at these department stores than he could back at home. My grandma's tiny, and she's still able to slip through crowds like a weasel, so we were always losing her in the crowds. Then we'd have to launch another Find Grandma expedition. In the course of those recovery missions, I'd sometimes think about running away. I already knew that there was a heroin scene in Hamburg, on Mönckeberg Street. All I would have had to do was run out of the department store and talk to a few junkies, the rest would have been easy. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I don't think I really knew what I wanted in the end. All I knew was that I'd rather die in a toilet stall somewhere than spend the rest of my life at a department store with these people. So yeah, I think if a junkie had walked up to me that day and talked to me, I would have been gone. I realized that my mood was kind of dangerous, so I told my aunts a few times that I needed to go. I can't take this anymore, I said. You can come back later and keep shopping without me, I won't mind. But they looked at me like I'd just dropped in from outer space. For them, going Christmas shopping was probably the highlight of their year. Even we'd finally finished up for the day, no one could remember where we'd parked the car. We ran from one garage level to the next and still nothing. I thought that it was a kind of fun situation since all of a sudden we were being forced to work together as a team. We talked over one another, everyone had different suggestions, but at least we had a common goal, we wanted to find that damn car. The only difference between the others and me was that I thought the whole thing was hilarious, and I couldn't stop laughing, while the others were already in a full-blown panic. In the meantime, it had gotten really cold, and everyone's teeth were chattering. I was still doing okay. I'd been through a lot worse. Then my aunt found a hot air vent in the entrance to Karstadt, and she decided to settle there. She stood right under the blower and refused to take another step. My uncle had to forcibly remove her. When we finally did find the car, we couldn't help but laugh. On the drive home, I felt really good. I felt like I was part of a real family. I adapted a little to my new family life. At least I tried to. It was hard. I had to keep a constant watch on my language, on every sentence, every word. When shit slipped out, my grandma would say, "Christiane. That's a very ugly word for such a pretty girl." Then a little fight would break out because those kinds of comments always pissed me off, and I couldn't keep myself from sulking. It led to a lot of outbursts from me. Christmas came. It was the first time in 2 years that I celebrated Christmas next to a Christmas tree. I'd spent the last 2 Christmas Eves out on the streets. I wasn't sure how I should feel about this Christmas tree. However, I decided to put on a smile and at least show some gratitude for the presents they'd bought for me. I really was happy about my presents. I'd never gotten this much for Christmas. But at some point, I caught myself adding up the cash value of my gifts and converting that amount into quarters. My dad visited over Christmas. As usual, he couldn't stay for long. On both Christmas nights 51 he took me to a club for the 18 and over crowd. My dad bought me all the rum and cokes I wanted, so I had like 6 or 7 each night and then dozed off at the bar. My dad was really pleased to see me drinking with him instead of shooting up. I was almost able to convince myself that I could eventually get used to these kinds of clubs and the people who went to them. My dad flew back to Berlin the next day. Apparently he'd become a hockey fan at some point, and there was some hockey game that he wanted to see. After Christmas vacation was over, I had to go back to school. I was set to begin 9th grade in the real school. At first, I was scared about starting up at school again. After all, I'd basically been AWOL for the past 3 years. The year before, I only showed up for a couple of months because the rest of the time I was either sick or in withdrawal again or just cutting class. But as it turned out, I kind of liked it at this school. On the first day, the class was busy painting a picture onto one of the boring white walls of the classroom. So I was able to join in immediately. We painted these beautiful houses, exactly the kinds of houses that I'd imagined I would live in. Out in front were happy, cheerful people. On the street out in front there was a palm tree with a camel tied to it. I loved it. Above the painting, we wrote the words, there's a beach under every sidewalk. But before long I could see that the kids out here weren't all that different from the young people in Berlin. There was a lot of dissatisfaction and anger out here, too. At the same time, things were more concealed in the country. The kids weren't as rowdy in school, and there were nowhere nearly as many pranks. Most of the teachers could still assert themselves. And most of the teens still dressed pretty conventionally. I wanted to do well in school, even though I'd already missed so much. I really wanted to graduate at least. For the first time since elementary school, I was doing homework. After 3 weeks, I'd adjusted myself pretty well and had settled into class. I got the feeling that I could really do this. We had just started in cooking class when I was called to the principal's office. When I got there, the principal was fiddling around with some document behind his desk. He looked nervous. It didn't take me more than a second to realize what was going on. He'd just received my file from Berlin. It explained everything about me. The youth welfare office had at some point sent a complete report to my school in Berlin, and after that they had sent it here. The principal spent some time clearing his throat before he said that, much to his regret, he couldn't allow me to continue at this school. I was, apparently, unable to cope with the demands of the program here. My file must have made me seem so hardened and intimidating that he couldn't even come get me himself. He had to send someone else. And it was so urgent that he couldn't even wait until the end of the school day to kick me out. I didn't say anything. I was speechless. The principal wanted me to leave right that instant. During the next break between classes, I was supposed to check in with the principal of the lower track secondary school, the Hauptschule. I was devastated. I went over to the other school in a complete daze. And once I was sitting in the office of my new principal, I just broke down and cried. He said that things really weren't as bad as I made them out to be. I should just take a seat, get to work, and set my sights on graduating with good grades. When I got outside, I took another good look at my situation. I didn't feel sorry for myself at all. I told myself, it goes without saying that now you're paying the price for all your old mistakes. All at once, I understood that all those dreams of a brand new life without dope were a total pile of crap. When other people looked at me now, they didn't see my new self, they just saw me. What's worse, they saw me through the lenses of my past actions and judged me by my past. Everybody did that, my mom, my aunt, and of course the principal, too. It was obvious that I couldn't change into a new person from one day to the next. My body and my mind kept handing me new bills. My liver reminded me constantly of what I'd done in the past. And it wasn't like I was perfectly well adjusted to life at my aunt's house either. The smallest thing would make me go totally crazy. There were constant fights. I couldn't bear the least bit of noise or stress around me. And when I was really depressed, I couldn't help remembering how effective drugs could be at banishing those kinds of feelings. After I got kicked out of the real school, I lost all my confidence in myself. I became really apathetic again. I couldn't defend myself against the expulsion, even though after only 3 weeks, there was no way this principal could have any informed opinion about whether or not I could actually make it in his school. I had no plans for the future. I could have gone back to a comprehensive school. There was one that I could get to by bus. In the comprehensive school, I'd have a chance to prove that I had brains. But I was way too afraid that I might fail there, too. It took a while for me to fully grasp what it meant to be downgraded to the Hauptschule program. We had 2 rec centers in our area, kind of like youth clubs. One was the hangout for students from the gymnasium and the real school, and the other one was the place where the Hauptschule students, along with some of the trade school kids, hung out. When I first arrived, I spent my time at the former. But once I was booted out of the real school, I got the feeling that the teens there were shunning me and shooting me disapproving looks. That's when I switched to the other club. That was a brand new experience for me. This sort of segregation didn't exist in Berlin, not in school, and not on the streets. The distinction was evident even when we gathered in the common ground outside. Right across the yard, they'd painted a white line. On one side were the students from the real school, and on the other side were the students from the Hauptschule. You weren't allowed to cross the white line. So now I could only talk to my former classmates from across this stupid line. I thought this was such bullshit. We had been separated into two groups. Young people in the real school still had a chance to achieve some success in life, while the young people in the Hauptschule were already being thought of as a lost cause. And so this was the new society in which I was supposed to adapt. Adapt was my grandma's favorite word. But at the same time, she told me that I shouldn't associate with kids from the Hauptschule when we weren't in class. Instead, she told me to try and make friends with the kids in the other programs. So I told her, why can't you just get used to the idea that your granddaughter is a student in the Hauptschule? That's where they stuck me, and that's where I have to adapt. So deal with it. That, of course, provoked a huge fight. At first, I wanted to just zone out at school. But then I realized that my new head teacher was actually okay. He was an older guy. Really old-fashioned. Really conservative, to put it bluntly. Sometimes I got the impression that he thought the Nazis might have had some good ideas. But he was able to maintain his authority without having to yell at us. He was the only teacher for whom everyone stood, on their own, when he came into the classroom. He was always calm, and he paid attention to each individual, giving us the time we all deserved. Even me. Some of the younger teachers were, I'm sure, hugely idealistic. But for the most part, that didn't get them very far. They couldn't handle the job. They were just about as clueless as their own students. They didn't know where to turn. Sometimes they just let it all go, and when the chaos was complete, they'd start screaming at us, totally unhinged. But the biggest problem was that none of these idealists had any good answers to the problems and questions that actually preoccupied us. They always came out with their ifs and buts because they were so unsure of everything. Their lack of self-confidence made them easily intimidated. Our head teacher, however, didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't want to give us any false expectations about what it meant to be a student in the Hauptschule. He told us that it was going to be incredibly difficult for us at each and every turn. But with some hard work and discipline, we could even do better in some areas than students in the gymnasium. For example, in spelling and grammar. These days, no one taking the university entrance exams could spell, write grammatically, or punctuate properly. As a result, we stood a better chance if we wrote our job applications in completely perfect German. He tried to teach us how to handle people who spoke down to us. And he knew some great sayings and quotes, which he never hesitated to use if a situation called for it. Mostly they were snippets of wisdom from the not-too-distant past. He let us laugh at them if we wanted, and most students did, but I also found that there was always a kernel of truth in them. I disagreed with him a lot, but what I liked about him was that he still seemed to know the difference between North and South. In other words, he knew where he was going and what he was about. Most of my classmates didn't like him as much as I did. They probably thought he was too tough, and his sermonizing got on their nerves. But most of them didn't care about school anyway. A few of them saw to it that they'd get a good report card and a diploma, hoping that maybe they could manage to snatch up an apprenticeship somewhere. Those types would do all their homework like boys and girls, following the instructions to the letter. But reading a book or taking an interest in something that wasn't assigned as homework, that never would be occurred to them. Even our head teacher or one of the younger teachers tried to get a discussion going, Then they all just sat and stared, looking stupid. Their plans for their future were just like mine, basically non-existent. What sorts of plans can a student in a high school have, anyway? If he were lucky, he'd get a spot as some kind of an apprentice. He couldn't just choose an apprenticeship according to what he thought would be fun or interesting, but he'd have to go with whatever was offered. Many didn't care anyway what they'd do after school. Maybe an apprenticeship or working as an unskilled laborer or collecting unemployment. The prevailing opinion was that nobody died of hunger in Germany. As a graduate from a high school, you didn't have much of a chance of doing something cool, so why bother wasting your energy? Why try hard? With some guys, you could already tell that they had criminal tendencies, and a few were already alcoholics. The girls didn't think too much about anything anyway. They'd preset their minds that some guy would take care of them someday, and until then they could work as a salesperson in a store or take a factory job in an assembly line or just hang around at their parents' house. Not everyone was like that, but that was definitely the general mood at school. Totally bleak, with no illusions and certainly no goals or ideals. When I thought about things that way, it hurt. I had imagined my life very differently. I'd often tried to figure out why the young people here were so miserable. They couldn't find any joy in anything. A moped at 16, a car at 18, that was somehow expected and taken for granted. And when that didn't happen, then it was a letdown, and you were considered inferior. In all my fantasies about my future, it always went without saying that when I set out on my own, I'd have an apartment to sleep in and a car to drive. To break your back working for an apartment or a new sofa like my mom did, that wasn't part of my plan. Those were the old-fashioned ideals of our parents, to live in order to just accumulate some stuff. For me, and I believe for many others also, those few material things were considered the minimum requirements for life. But then something else had to follow that elusive thing that makes life meaningful. And that was nowhere in sight. But a few of us, at least, were still searching for it. I know I was. When we were talking about German history and the Nazis in school, I had very conflicting feelings. On the one hand, it turned my stomach when I thought about the horrendous, gruesome brutality that these human beings were capable of. On the other hand, I liked it that the possibility existed for people to believe in something. I said as much in class. In some ways I think I would have liked to have been a teenager during the time of the Nazis. At least the young people back then had some ideals and could believe in something. I wasn't really serious about that. But there was some truth in it. Even out here in the country, the teens were into all kinds of crazy shit because they wanted a little more out of life than their parents could give them back at home. Hooliganism had even found a place in our small village. The youth were into giving punches instead of taking them. 2 years prior, in Berlin, there were a couple of kids who were really into the punk movement. It always gave me the chills when I realized that some people, who were otherwise okay people, would think that being a punk was cool. When it comes down to it, it's really just sheer brutality, at least what I've seen of it. The music reflects that, just a driving, brutal rhythm without any imagination. I knew a punk in our area pretty well. You could actually talk to him as long as he didn't stick a safety pin through his cheek or start pulling his brass knuckles out of his pocket. Later, he got beat up in our local pub. His attackers broke 2 chairs over his head and then rammed a broken bottle into his stomach. He just barely pulled through in the hospital. Violence always really upset me, especially when it happened in the course of a relationship. Everybody talks about women's liberation now. But it seems to me that, without a doubt, boys have never treated girls as brutally as they do now. That's where all the guys' frustration comes out. They want to have power and success, and when they feel disappointment, they wind up taking it out on women and mistreating women. I developed a real revulsion toward most of the guys at the local clubs. Maybe it was because I looked a little different from the other girls, but for whatever reason I was a constant target for these guys. I heard a lot of whistles and come-ons, and I heard the word bitch a lot, and honestly, it bothered me even more now than it did when the customers driving by on the Kurfürstenstrasse would make a gesture toward me. When a customer in Berlin waves you to his car, then at least he's smiling. But the guys here, who all thought they were God's gift to women, didn't think they needed to make the slightest effort. I think that most Johns were friendlier and more affectionate than these assholes out here. These guys wanted to fuck you without knowing the first thing about you, without showing the least bit of kindness or affection, and, of course, without having the decency to pay for the privilege either. My revulsion against guys went so far that I wouldn't let anyone touch me. Their rules were disgusting. According to them, a boy had the right to stand kissing and feeling up a girl after their second date. And the girls went along with it, even if they didn't have the slightest interest in the guy who had asked them out. They went along with it because those were the rules. And because if they didn't, they were afraid that the guy would dump them, and then the guys would all talk about what a frigid bitch she was. I just couldn't do that. I didn't want to. Even if I really liked a boy and started going on some dates with him, I made it very clear right from the stand, don't ever try any funny stuff with me. Don't touch me. If something's going to happen between us, then I will be the one to start it. In the 6 months since I'd first left Berlin, I hadn't had one serious boyfriend. Up to that point, every friendship had ended abruptly, as soon as the boy tried to sleep with me. As soon as I said no. Even though I'd gotten away from drugs and my old life, my past was still with me. Even though I imagined that the business of prostitution didn't have any real connection to me anymore, that it was only an unavoidable side effect of my heroin addiction, it still played a major role in the way I dealt with boys. The way they usually behaved just reinforced my impression that men just wanted to use me and take advantage of me. I tried to communicate something of my past experiences to the girls in my class without being too explicit. But I never got my message through to them. The only thing that changed was that now I became a son of Der Abwehr type in my class and had to listen to all kinds of problems and offer my advice because they did pick up on the fact that I was, somehow, a little more experienced than they were. But still, they never understood what I was really trying to tell them. Most of the girls were obsessed with boys. They didn't think there was anything wrong with all the cruelty and even violence that was part and parcel of their relationships. Even a guy stood up his girlfriend to go out with a different girl, she didn't get pissed at the guy, instead, they developed a grudge against the new girlfriend. That new girl was immediately transformed into a cow, a bitch, a fucking whore, and God knows what else. And the darker and more distant a guy was, the more the girls wanted him. I only really understood this when our class went on a trip to the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate. Not far from where we were staying was a dance club. Most of the girls were obsessed with going over there on the first night. When they got back, they raved about all the awesome guys that were there. They told me all about their motorcycles, too. I took a walk over to the club, and it didn't take me long to figure out what was going on there. Guys from all over the neighborhood came there on their mopeds, motorcycles, and cars in order to seduce schoolgirls who were there visiting on their class trips. I tried to explain that to the girls in my class, that in a place like this, the guys were literally only interested in sex, but they didn't have much interest in my warnings or experience. An hour before the club opened, these chicks were all in front of the mirrors, putting on makeup and fussing with their hair. Then they refused to move because they didn't want to mess up their hairdos. It seemed like they were losing an essential part of themselves when they stood in front of the mirror like that. All that remained of them was a mask, which was only supposed to look appealing to the guys on the motorcycles. It really pissed me off to see that. In a way, of course, it also reminded me of myself. I'd also hidden behind makeup and costumes in order to look good to the guys who had the drugs, first pot and then dope. And I'd also given up my own self, only to become a slave to heroin. The whole class trip now revolved entirely around these cocky bikers, even though most of the girls already had steady boyfriends at home. Elk, my roommate, wrote a letter to her boyfriend on the first night. But on the second night, she went to the club and came back totally depressed. She said that she'd been making out with someone. I think she only did that so that she could prove to the other girls that she could get one of the bikers interested in her. She felt really guilty because of her boyfriend and even started to cry. She actually believed, though, that she'd fallen in love with the motorcycle guy. Her boyfriend, of course, didn't have a motorcycle. The next night she returned, totally devastated, and cried her eyes out. Her biker friend had, apparently, asked another girl in our class, "So, what's up, is your friend ready for a ride yet or what?" There was another girl, Rosie, who was even worse. A teacher caught her with one of those guys in a car, just as the two of them were getting busy. Rosie was so drunk she could barely walk. That guy knew what he was doing, and all night long he kept ordering her more rum and cokes. Rosie had been a virgin, but now she was a wreck. The other girls were calling a meeting to discuss what to do about her. They didn't get all upset about the guy who'd gotten Rosie drunk and then more or less raped her. No, they actually demanded that Rosie sent home. I was the only one who objected. They were furious because our teachers had put a new rule in place that prohibited anyone from going back to the club. They were all upset over the fact that Rosie's little party had put an end to all the makeout sessions that they were looking forward to themselves. It really sucked to see how no one cared at all about anyone else in this group. There was absolutely no sense of solidarity among the girls. Whenever a guy arrived on the scene, friendships were bound to break up. In a way, it really wasn't any different with heroin, which ruined the relationships among Stella, Babsy, and me over and over again. Although I wasn't directly involved, the drama made me feel hopeless and emotionally drained. The last 2 days of the class trip, I had a relapse. I was absolutely gone the whole time. In the meantime, however, I had resolved to cope with this world just the way it was. I didn't think about running away anymore. It was clear to me that escaping was really just another way of boxing myself into a life on drugs. And I kept pointing out to myself, as bluntly as I could, that it never amounted to anything good. I thought that there had to be another way. There had to be a kind of compromise available, that would allow me to cope with the world, with society, without giving in and giving up completely. Then I got a boyfriend, and he definitely had a calming effect on me. I could really talk to him. And despite everything, he always seemed to be able to keep his priorities in order. He knew what mattered. He could dream, yet he could also find a practical solution for everything. And at the same time, he wasn't blind to all the real problems that surrounded us. But he believed that if you could achieve some success yourself, then you could make your own, better world, no matter how small. That would make a difference. His plan was to become a businessman and make a bunch of money and then afterward buy a log cabin in the Canadian woods and live there. Canada was his big dream, just like FOREWORD. He was a student in the gymnasium, the college preparatory track, and he got me excited about learning again. I realized that even the Hope School could offer me something as long as my goal was to actually learn, and not just get through the ridiculous, useless, moronic requirements for the Hope School diploma. I read a lot. I picked up books almost at random. Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, Hermann Hesse, and especially Erich Fromm. His book The Art of Loving became like a Bible to me. I learned whole pages by heart, simply because I felt that I had to read them over and over again. I also copied passages from the book and taped them above my bed. Fromm really had the right perspective on things. He understood what really mattered. If you listened to his advice and actually followed it, then your life would be meaningful because then you'd be able to make it into what you wanted it to be. At the same time though, it's so difficult to live by his rules because no one else has to follow them with you, most people don't even know about them. I wish I could have a conversation with Eric Fromm about how he lives in this world while also following his principles. But in any event, I realized that the real world sometimes escapes the grasp of his essential principles. I thought that Fromm's book ought to have been the single most important book in our curriculum. But I never dared to bring it up in class because the others would have probably just turned it, and me, into a joke. Sometimes I took the book to school with me. Once, I was reading it during class because I thought I could find an answer in it to a question that had come up in class. The teacher saw that, looked at the title, and immediately took the book away from me. When I wanted to have it back at the end of class, he said, "So, the little miss likes to read pornography in class, does she?" "No, I'm sorry, this book will remain confiscated for the time being." He actually said that to me. The name Fromm didn't mean anything to him. And the title just sounded like porn to his ignorant ears, I guess. What else could love be for these frustrated men, anyway? So he came to the natural conclusion that Christiane just wanted to corrupt the kids in his class after spending time in Berlin as a drug-addicted hooker. The next day, he gave me the book back and said it was okay. Still, he advised me not to bring it to school anymore because the title was misleading. There were a lot of things like that, and this thing with the Fromm book was really only the tip of the iceberg. Other things made me way more upset. Like once, I got in trouble with the principal. He was another one of those totally frustrated, insecure guys. He was completely incapable of taking control of anything, even though he was the principal. He tried to compensate for that with yelling and a lot of senseless exercises. When we had class with him in the morning, we had to sing a song and do some exercises before we did anything else. He said it was meant to help us wake up. You only got good grades in his class if you did exactly what he said. He was also our music teacher. And one time, he wanted to do us a favor, that at least was something new, and talk about music that we cared about. He started by talking about today's jazz music. I had no idea what he meant by that. I thought that maybe he was referring to pop, and so I said, "What do you actually mean when you say, today's jazz music? If you're talking about pop and rock, that's not the word we use." Maybe I said it in the wrong tone of voice again or something. I'm sure I probably started spouting off without first thinking about what I really wanted to convey. In any case, the principal went ballistic. He screamed like a lunatic and sent me out of the class. At the door, I turned around and tried to calm things down a bit. I said to him, "I think we must have each other." So he called me back in. But in the end, I couldn't go back, so I spent the rest of the class out in the hall. At least I was under control enough to stick around the building and not just take off for home. After class was over, I had to go to the principal's office. As soon as I walked in, I could see that he had my folder in his hand. He thumbed through the file and pretended to read it. Then he said that I wasn't in Berlin anymore. And incidentally, I was only a guest at his school anyway. And under these circumstances, he could kick me out at any time. So I better stan appreciating his hospitality. I could feel myself losing it. I didn't want to go back to school at all. Even little things were still setting me off back then, and this was big. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just shrug it off and tell myself that this idiot didn't really have any influence over my life. He did. But if he can only fight you with some paper files, then in a way he knows that he's already lost. I managed to keep my big mouth shut in his office, and after that incident I tried my best to be inconspicuous. Before this, My boyfriend had encouraged me to try and do well on my finals at the Hope School and then to try to get into a comprehensive school after that. But I knew how hard that would be, in real terms, as a student from the Hope School. And as things stood now, I didn't want to hear another word about school. I was sure that I wouldn't be able to hack it. The psychological fitness tests, the special permission from the superintendent, and all the other stuff you had to do if you wanted to get out of the Hope School were just too much. And I knew that my file from Berlin was always going to be one step ahead of me. But at least I had my sensible boyfriend, and I was developing some friendships with the teenagers in the town who in their own way really appealed to me. They were pretty different from what I was used to, but they were way better than all the assholes from the club and the other town nearby. There was a real community spirit among them. There weren't any alpha males or hotshots among them. Everything had a sort of old-fashioned order, even if the boys did get drunk every now and then. And most of them accepted me, despite how unusual I must have seemed to them. For a while, I thought I could be like them. I thought I could live a life like my boyfriend had. But I couldn't make it last. I broke up with my boyfriend as soon as he started pushing for sex. I just couldn't do it. I simply couldn't imagine sleeping with anyone besides Ditlev. So I guess I still loved Ditlev. I thought a lot about him, even though I didn't want to. Sometimes I wrote him letters, which I intended to send to Rolf, the last person he'd lived with. But at least I still had enough sense left not to send the letters. I heard that Ditlev had wound up in jail again. Stella was there, too. I thought a lot about both of them. I missed them. But there were a lot of people around me now who I really liked, too. I felt much closer to them than I ever had to the kids in the village where I first grew up. They were easy to talk to, and we could talk about anything including my problems. I felt accepted by them and didn't have to worry that they'd find out about my past. They saw the world like I saw it. I didn't have to pretend or adapt. We were on the same wavelength. Despite that, I was worried about getting any closer with them. Because at the time, they were all experimenting with drugs. My mom, my aunt, and we all thought I'd landed in a corner of Germany that had been untouched by drugs, or at least by hard drugs. When the papers reported anything about heroin, it had happened in Berlin or Frankfurt. I looked at things the same way myself. I figured I had to be the only ex-junkie 4 miles around. However, I grew to know better right after one of our first shopping expeditions. Early in 1978, we drove to Norderstedt, a kind of dormitory suburb of Hamburg, comprised of all new high-rises, to go shopping. As I always did when we went on these road trips, I kept an eye on people who seemed like they were stoned. I'd been watching a couple of guys, and I was thinking to myself, are they shooting up? Smoking pot? Or maybe they are just students. Before I got my answer, we went into a snack bar to get a hot dog. At one table, there were a few poor foreigners hanging around together. 2 of them suddenly got up and moved to another table. I didn't know why, but I immediately had the feeling that heroin was involved. I made my aunt hurry up and leave without telling her about my suspicions. Just 100 yards further on, in front of a jeans shop, we walked right into the center of the Norderstedt heroin scene. There were junkies everywhere. Then I imagined that they were all looking at me. And that they had immediately recognized me as one of their own. I started freaking out. Heading for an all-out panic. I grabbed my aunt by the arm and told her that I had to leave immediately. She could kind of tell what was going on and said, "But why? You aren't involved with that sort of thing anymore." I said, "Just drop it. I'm not ready for this yet." At that point, I already knew that I was done running. And when I knew that I'd be able to stay away from heroin for the rest of my life if I wanted to. It shocked me that, despite my new resolve, they still had recognized me. So when I got home, I peeled off my clothes right away and scrubbed the makeup off my face. My high-heeled boots were fired, effective immediately. From that day on, I tried to look like the girls in my class. But while at the club, I now hung out more frequently with the people who smoked pot and went tripping. Sometimes I smoked a pipe right along with them, and occasionally I just said no. I really liked these kids. Most of them were apprentices somewhere and came from the surrounding villages. They all had brains and were interested in using them, so they were nothing like the helplessly defeated students at the Hope School. They thought about things, about politics and issues. When I had a conversation with any of them, I usually left excited, almost inspired. They were just good people. No one fought. The violence was elsewhere. This was a totally peaceful group. One time, but only once, I asked some of them why we couldn't do what we were doing now without getting high. They blew me off. They said it was a stupid question. After all the shit that happens in the course of a day, how else were you supposed to relax? They were all disappointed with their jobs. The one guy who wasn't was in a union and was working as an apprentice's ombudsman. He found meaning in his daily work. He looked after the interests of the other young people in that business, and that gave him satisfaction. He was also of the opinion that our society could be changed. He was on a pretty even keel. He didn't smoke at all, and when he drank it was usually just a glass of red. The others didn't see any meaning in what they were doing. They were constantly talking about quitting. The only thing was, they didn't know what to do next. When they got off work, they were frustrated, bitter, and angry. When we got together, one of them always started talking about how he hated his boss or about how something had gone horribly wrong, until someone else would finally interrupt, enough about work. Then a pipe would be passed around, and their post-work lives would begin. I felt like in a way I was still better off than them. Sometimes I actually had some fun in school. On the other hand, I was just like them. There wasn't really any grand purpose behind all this studying and stress. By that time, it had become clear to me that I'd never be able to take my college exams or get into the real school. And I also knew that as a former addict, I wasn't eligible for a lot of the jobs I might be interested in later, no matter how well I did on my finals at the Hope School. Still, when the time came, I did do well on my exams and got really good grades before I left. It didn't earn me an apprenticeship, but I did get a temporary job, thanks to some law meant to keep unemployed young people off the streets. I haven't used heroin for almost a year. But I'm aware, of course, that it takes a couple of years before you're completely clean. And at the moment there are no big problems. At night when we sit together, my friends and I, drinking wine and smoking, then all those small daily problems have a tendency to disappear. We talk about the books we're reading. We talk about the news and mysticism and whatever else comes up. We're all into Buddhism right now. We're looking for people who see the world in a different way than we do, so that we can learn from them. So far our own lives haven't proved to be quite what we'd hoped. A girl in our clique is doing an apprenticeship as a nurse, and she brought some pills back one day. For a while, I was back on Valium. I won't touch acid, though, because I'm afraid to go on a horror trip. The others all seem to enjoy it. There aren't any hard drugs in our small town. If anyone wants to get into that scene, they have to go to Hamburg. No one around has any age, so that makes it easy to avoid temptation. It's not like Berlin or Hamburg or even Norderstedt. But if you're desperate to score, it's not really that hard. There are guys with connections. And sometimes a dealer passes through who has a real arsenal. If you ask somebody like that if he's got something to get high on, he'd most likely ask, "What do you want?" Valium, methadone, pot, acid, coke, or dope. All the people that I hang out with these days believe they have the drug thing under control. There are definitely a few things that are different here than they were back at Gropiusstadt with all my old friends. This new group is looking for something entirely different when they use drugs. It's not about getting away from ourselves now or numbing ourselves with pounding music and dancing. In fact, for these guys, the atmosphere at the sound would be like torture. It would be the opposite of a high. We all hate the city. We're into nature now. On weekends, we drive all over Schleswig-Holstein, and then we just park the car and start walking until we find a good spot. Often we end up on the moors, in places where nobody else would ever think to go. But the best place of all, the place we all really love, is the limestone quarry. It's an enormous crater right smack dab in the middle of nowhere. More than half a mile long, 200 yards wide, 100 yards deep. The walls of the quarry are almost entirely vertical. It's warm at the bottom. No wind. There are plants growing down there, plants like we've never seen anywhere else. Incredibly clear streamlets flow through this crazy valley. Waterfalls come right out of the walls. The water turns the walls a rusty red. Everywhere you look you can see these bizarrely shaped white rocks, some of which look like the bones of ancient animals, maybe even mammoths. The gigantic excavator and the conveyor belts, which made so much noise during the week, on weekends looked like they'd been hibernating underground for centuries. The limestone covered them all in a blanket of white. When we go there, we're all alone. All alone in this crazy magical hole. The rest of the world is kept at bay by the steep, vertical limestone walls. There's no noise that can reach us from the outside. All we can hear is the water cascading down the quarry walls. We always imagine that someday we'll buy this quarry, once the mining operation is closed down. We want to build our log cabins down here, put in a huge garden, tend to our pets, and make sure we'd have whatever we need to live on. Then we'd blow up the only path out of the quarry. We wouldn't ever want to come up again anyway.